In the middle of hungry monsters and swirling dust, one guy stands out, cloak snapping in the wind, refusing to flinch or move, like he can't even see the evil closing in. This guy's an alchemist. He smashes multiple techniques together to forge something brand new, and somehow it also lets him stash items away with spatial storage. Since alchemy can fix anything, he flashes a smug grin and pulls out a whole stack of magic swords from his storage. No doubt, they were forged with alchemy. A flash of light and a surge of staff energy burst around him, and in the blink of an eye, a dozen swords tore through the threat. This guy isn't ordinary at all. He's a genius, a alchemist, a vacant ord. The system dies in total silence, and right then, bam, the capsule door snaps open, blasting brutal winds and whipping up clouds of dust that scatter everywhere. As the capsule fully unsealed, Vakenord slid out like he meant business, gripping the structure's edge as he inched forward, one leg out first, then whipped his head around, stunned by what he saw. The boy spun around in that strange new world, staring at everything like it might bite, trying to figure out where he was, only to realize every single thing around him felt completely alien and unknown. All he could see was a desolate ruin, just rubble swallowed by creeping greenery, the remnants of a once beautiful building, with only the ghost of its former glory still standing there. Vakenord got hit with a brutal illness, and no matter how hard he fought or tried to adapt, it slowly, relentlessly ate away at the strong, healthy body he used to have. A wild idea sparked in his head, and on a whim, he dove into the cradle of rebirth to wipe out his illness, only to crash into a coma and sleep for what felt like forever. He got hit by pure joy so strong he couldn't stop shaking, and when he realized his hard work paid off, because he was still alive, happiness flooded him in a way he couldn't even put into words. Bacon snapped his head back, sucked in a long, confident breath and felt it. His memories stayed put, and the illness that'd been wrecking him finally backed off because the coughing fits were gone for good. He smirked through it, replaying every shouted exclamation and every twitchy worry from the people he'd told his idea to. You saw it right. My experiment worked, the alchemist chuckled. The hero snapped around in a heartbeat, caught his own reflection in the mirror, and froze in shock at what stared back. So wild he halted immediately and scrutinized his face like it was a mystery. The body suddenly looked shockingly young again, like it was reborn at 20, flooding back every ounce of fresh energy it once had in its prime. But this wasn't sad at all. His past memories hit him like lightning, and deep down he was still over 40. With a grin stretched wide and joy blazing in his chest, Vaken declared, no doubts, no hesitation, that he was going to keep pushing deeper into alchemy, the passion he loved more than anything. But there was one last question that burned just as bright. What happened to that lab, and why was it wrecked like that? He snapped his fingers and ordered the test to launch. The boy demanded answers from Zosmos, and in the dead quiet, Bacon's sharp demand cut through as he spoke to his faithful assistant. A tiny light like a glowing star plucked from the heavens came crashing down from the sky, exploding into a blinding beam. Zosmos' answer cut through the air because he was a fairy, built artificially by Vaken. Zosmos brightened up and greeted his friend like no time had passed, but before he even could savor it, he only answered the owner's request. Verification done, and somehow 501 years and 17 days had slipped by. Vaken couldn't take it in. He shot the question again, fear clawing at his chest as he blurted, no, that can't be true. 50 to 21 years. The horror in his voice crushed him, because he simply couldn't wrap his mind around something like that. He flung his hands up and blurted, half in shock, wait, did I really sleep this long? And the reply hit like a thunderclap. The alchemist slept 521 years inside the cradle of rebirth. But what happens to the lab? Where did everyone vanish to, and what becomes of the Morty's dynasty? Questions piled up, yet answers didn't show up right away, so we've got to dive into the archives, because Zosmos was stuck in sleep mode. After digging through the archives, the assistant snapped the news. Nothing was left. The hero erupted in shock. How is that even possible? The sage's power is gone, so the archive data might be off, meaning the hero's left staring at the chaos, begging for answers on what war or catastrophe finally broke loose. To calm his mind, Zosmos told him to write everything down. The hero plopped down to scribble every detail of what just happened, plus everything he knew about his rebirth and exactly how long he'd been out cold. After finally calming down and letting out a long breath, Vakenord realized, whoa, this whole thing was way more interesting than he'd expected. And yeah, this whole mess was downright fascinating to the alchemist, and he couldn't help but light up with pure enthusiasm. He didn't just get reborn, he got thrown into a whole new era too, and the hero and the fairy erupted in joy because it actually worked. So much time had roared by that alchemy had skyrocketed past anything anyone expected, and the alchemist just reveled in it, thrilled because an endless stack of brand new wonders still waited for him. As a researcher, he burned with curiosity about the bright future. Then the world flipped, and everything changed in a whole new era. Joy burst through him as he pictured, in vivid detail, how every city looks right now, how the crowds pack the streets, how the scenery shifts around him, and how time and fresh trends have reshaped those roads. There's no way to know if the future really shifted, so the hero decided to confirm it himself and ordered the ferry to teleport him straight to the nearest city. The moment his eyes snapped open, Vacant was already perched on a ledge, staring down at the whole city below, just a normal, everyday place. He spun around the streets, totally baffled. How in the world could this be happening? Zosimos and his master swept the rooftops in a swift flight, scanning the area like they were hunting something. Vacant stared around, stunned, unable to believe 500 years had gone by, and the landscape looked almost exactly the same. He'd always pictured a future that would change everything, but reality flipped the script. After a while, his assistant finally cracked the archive and dragged out what they could, because even scraps of information were pure gold to them right now. They suddenly landed in the kingdom of Juri, right in the city of Saowan. Zosimos declared that this nation is already 200 years deep, and that a king rules it with an aristocracy at his side, a proper classical monarchy. But the biggest clue hit hard. There wasn't a single hint of alchemists anywhere in this country. No names, no records, no mention at all. It felt like they never even set foot here, and their whole existence had been wiped clean from history. He sat there looking calm on the surface, but you could tell sadness and disappointment were weighing on him, and with a heavy exhale, he tried to shove every emotion he'd been holding back out into the air. The alchemist blurted, furious and breathless, that this couldn't be real. No way, it was impossible to believe, while the fairy looked downright unimpressed. Alchemy can crack the wildest problems humanity faces, and it's the lifeline people need, powering everything from everyday life to impossible breakthroughs. It isn't just useful, it simply can't disappear. The hero brushed off the fairy's objections and said, "Don't trust the archives alone. Everything has to be verified on its own." And when Zosimos tried to defend himself, he could only spit out one excuse. The sage's tower was being run by someone seriously strange. Vacant strolled through the city streets, soaking in every detail like it might explode into something amazing, but all he got was the same old sights, familiar buildings, strangers drifting past, everyday life playing on repeat until nothing could snag his attention. He finally reached the market, bursting with bright colors and sweet smells, where fresh vegetables and fruits piled up on the counters beside warm-baked goods. People hurried past one another, swapping talk about products, picking the best deals, or just soaking in the buzz of the place. Suddenly, Bacon clutched his stomach as it rumbled from pure hunger, sharp, unbearable pain, until the alchemist snapped back to reality and realized he hadn't eaten or drunk a single thing in 500 years. He's desperate to hunt down money for food, but after 521 years, money's value has warped so much he can't even begin to guess what he needs to survive. Vacant whipped around the moment he heard the merchant speak, and it totally caught him off guard. Draped in a dark cloak, the young man clutched a tiny jar of glittering liquid like it was treasure, swearing it was a healing potion to bring his health and strength roaring back, and even carrying an antidote bottle too. Without a shred of restraint, Bacon barreled into the cellar, firing off wild questions about whether he'd made the potion himself, and if that meant Bacon was an alchemist. When he got a clear yes, he lunged in and snatched the bottle right from the young man in the cloak. The alchemist stared into the vessel like it was a locked secret, scrutinizing every detail of the liquid's composition, its taste and aroma, so intensely it felt like he was analyzing it to the bone without even cracking the vessel open. But that thrill crashed instantly, because it wasn't a real potion at all, just garbage stuffed with the cheapest ingredients anyone could scrape together. The hero's face twisted into a hard frown, because if he'd coached something that awful, he'd have made himself redo it 100 times over. But maybe, just maybe, this merchant's profit was so tiny it barely mattered. His stomach let out a brutal growl, and Bacon's mind spun with questions. But right now, something else screamed louder. The merchant told him to head straight to the tavern across the street. Over the tavern door, a gorgeous wooden duck soared through the air with wings spread wide, and right beside it, the sign proudly read, "The Dancing Duck ****." The hungry alchemist leaned in, eyes widening with curiosity, and a small smile broke across his face, because this plain little building was shockingly beautiful, and it somehow made him feel at ease. The hero and his assistant nodded along, stunned by how the tavern dazzled them, from that magnificent wooden figurine to the roof towering overhead. Zosimos snapped out about their lack of money, but Bacon stayed eerily calm and decided it wasn't even a problem. Of course he's an alchemist. His skills will wipe out the cost in seconds, and if he's forced to wash dishes, he'll just invent some killer machine that does it for him. As he slammed the bell, the tavern's owner thought, "This employee's got to be kind. Just let me explain myself, and they'll understand everything right away." A girl's silhouette snapped into view behind the guy, and her sharp question cut through his thoughts, so the stranger demanded answers. Who was she, and why had she come here? As she stepped closer, you could see the hurt in her eyes, arms crossed tight, wavy light hair tucked neatly under a scarf. And then she sighed, telling them the tavern was closed and urging them to get out. The alchemist and his assistant snapped into panic, like they weren't wanted here at all. Hunger clawed at them, and he tried to explain it all to the girl, but her non-stop apologies cut him off. Tears spilled down her cheeks until her eyes went glassy, and with her father locked in a sickbed by a brutal illness, she had to keep the tavern running all by herself. Vaken caught that moment, stepped forward with a grin, introduced himself as an alchemist, and offered his help on the spot. Even though the girl was stunned, the alchemist and the fairy were already diving into how they could pay for the room with medical services, but her shock snapped into pure rage. She slammed her arm out of their rushed thoughts and clocked the intruder right in the face. Bam! The whole building echoed with the impact. With tears spilling down her face, the blonde blurted that she'd never trust the alchemist again, because her father got sick after drinking vitamins he'd made. Bacon couldn't hide his shock. He sprinted to the tavern owner's side, then immediately started pleading with the daughter to let him in, and she shut him down cold. The hero refused to quit. He even offered his help for free, but the girl still wouldn't bend, no matter how he tried to charm her. And tell me, how can anyone believe words that sweet? Once the girl finally caught her breath and sorted her thoughts, she turned to him and blurted out the question burning in her mind. Why on earth was he so stubborn about helping her father? Zosimos took control of everything, and as he praised the tavern and claimed the owner was clearly a stand-up guy, his master only shook his head like he didn't buy it at all. Then the girl started to doubt. Vaken's assistant talked the girl up, swearing the alchemist was incredibly experienced, and then pushed her to introduce herself right there. "I'm Fiora," she said, "a waitress working at this very tavern." Zosimus stepped up, introduced himself, and said, "I'm an artificial fairy. My master built me and poured all his knowledge into my core." When he wanted to introduce his master, he just strode right past, like he'd flipped into full alchemist mode already, locked in and laser-focused on the problem. The assistant blurted out his master's name like it was nothing, calling him Vacant Trouble, even as he marched into the room with the sick man right behind the girl. In the corner of a warm, well-furnished room sat a bed holding a sick man, wrapped tight, barely breathing, and utterly still, like his soul had slipped into another world. The alchemist closed in and his stomach dropped. What he saw was pure horror. The man was decomposing right there, alive, his face crawling with foul ulcers while his skin looked like it was peeling away from the very flesh covering it. Bacon instantly knew this wasn't some simple potion poisoning. This was way worse, and it hit him right in the gut. Toxins tore through his body and made him rot from the inside out, and the whole thing was downright horrifying and sickening. Tears streaming down her face, the man's daughter rushed to tell him that her father had slipped into a coma the very day before, and the moment it happened, that awful stench started flooding the room. It was far worse than the alchemist ever dared to imagine. It's downright outrageous. This alchemist is clueless at best, reckless at worst, because the moment they start treating people, everything gets worse, and their low-grade remedies are bad news from the start. This can never be forgiven, so Quanzhang's rage burned so hot it felt endless, and this brutal moment shattered him, sparking a wild storm of emotions inside. With pure grit on his face and a mission to flip the situation, he shot his hand up, and the moment he did, a gentle, comforting glow wrapped around it, pouring out warm light. He strutted in with full confidence, locked onto the task, and pushed himself to the limit, because this was the moment he'd prove to everyone what he really had. He didn't pause for even a breath. He ordered the fairy to hunt down what shoved the patient into that condition. He swung his hand through the air, scrawling a glowing strange symbol, while pushing his assistant A forward, again and again. A minute later, an alchemical pot materialized in the room, carving out a tiny space where you can synthesize and swap out conceptual information from all kinds of substances. Meanwhile, Zosmos uncovered the truth. This whole curse sprang from one thing. A potion for fatigue and stamina recovery was mixed wrong. Bacon erupted in rage, because that was the exact reason the poisoning hit. Any amateur in alchemy knows you can stop it. The worried girl whipped her head toward the alchemist, praying her father would be okay, but the alchemist barely even glanced at her, locked deep in his work like nothing else in the world mattered. He kept drawing signs in the air, now with both hands, each move crisp, steady, and confident, like he finally knew exactly what he was doing. He stood there as gentle winds curled around him. then 4 glowing circles burst into view right above his head. With a serious, laser-focused look still on his face, he couldn't hide the satisfaction as he realized this girl was insanely lucky in this moment. From all 4 circles spilled a wild haul for a potion, an unknown herb, a couple of bottles, and even a pouch. The alchemist told her not to fret. Her father was right here, and he'd step in to help. He tilted his head back and reveled in what he was doing, because for the first time in ages, freedom and calm hit him so hard it felt unreal. Around him, energy and glowing light streamed through the air like magic, washing over him with pure joy and peace. Once all the ingredients were in place, the vacant, on full command, sent them rocketing into the alchemical pot, and they vanished in a blink, blasting a blinding streak of light while a soft little breeze danced through the air behind them. The pot suddenly blazed with a bright, weird glow, like a living flame woke up inside, and that warm light spilled through the whole room, wrapping everything in cozy comfort. The alchemist flung his arms wide and kept conjuring energy and blazing rays of light, then realized with a jolt that he loved every second of it. He truly believed that pouring his heart into alchemy, studying it and putting it to work, would forge his own growth, sharpen his skills, and help him carve out a brighter future for all of humanity. No matter what happened to alchemy while he slept for 500 years, people kept chasing tomorrow, then kept chasing it again, because that hunger for a brighter future is just how humans are built. That's why Vacant and the other alchemists kept grinding side by side, running one study after another, chasing answers relentlessly to make life better for everyone around them. The alchemist never forgot his comrades' faces, proudly studying new ideas with him, building their skills side by side, and pushing through every brutal setback together. He shut his eyes, snapped his arms across his face, and with a sharp pop that rang through the room, the hero braced for the final move. Bellowing "Create," he snapped his eyes open and blasted streams of light wild across the room, total chaos, until in the blink of an eye, they all slammed together into one blazing, sparkling star that lit everything. The lights died, and right then, the alchemist had Arunia's spiritual medicine clutched in his hands. With it, he could crush the poison's symptoms with the potion and kickstart the body's regeneration process. Once the order hit, Zosmos leaned in and sucked the medicinal potion out of that open jar like a sponge. Then he shot up over the patient, circled above him, and dumped everything straight onto the bed. The medicine rained down on the tavern owner like some magic dust, sparkling in the sun, and the moment it touched him, his face started clearing fast, his skin turning from sickly to healthy. Zosmos wrapped up his work and told them the body would bounce back in just a couple of hours, and you could already see the medicine hit, because a faint, barely their calm settled onto the man's face. Vacant snapped to the girl and promised her everything would be fine with her father, only for her to stand there, stunned, baffled, and totally clueless about what just happened. The alchemist let out a satisfied smile. He'd crafted the perfect medicine. It would drain the man's strength hard, but he'd feel better, so the alchemist decided to buy him another 2 or 3 days of rest. Sensing the moment was his, the guy begged to stay in the tavern a while longer, insisting he needed to watch the patient's condition. The assistant was on edge, fearing the girl would blab about the weird flying cube, because nobody here has a clue about artificial creatures, but it turns out Fiora didn't even understand what it was. The young waitress burst into joyful tears, a warm, genuine smile lighting up her face, and she couldn't even find the words to thank him. Vacant met her eyes and flashed a warm smile, because to him this was more than a job, it was his alchemist's calling, the duty he swore to serve the people. Her eyes snapped wide with shock, like she'd pictured alchemists in some totally different world, and now reality hit hard. A few days later, while Vacant chewed in silence, he let out a heavy sigh, lifted his fork to his lips, and finally started talking, admitting he still hadn't fully snapped back to normal, and that some of his power was gone. Zosmos nodded along with his master's logic, because everything about him had clearly shifted. His magic and intellect were weaker, even his psychological age had dropped, and that meant he had to stay on guard. The grieving alchemist swallowed the truth. He'd gotten weaker, and that's how it would be from now on, until a sharp elbow slammed into the back and tore his thoughts apart. Edgar, the buzzing, cheerful tavern owner, gripped a massive, juicy slab of meat, beamed like the sun, and pressed the young guy at the table to eat more, because the kid was his debtor. Vacant awkwardly tried to wiggle out of it since he was already stuffed, but Edgar would not budge. A kid's body needs to eat big. And the way he devoured those insanely tasty tavern dishes, he ended up packing on about 5 kilograms. The Dancing Duck's owner tapped the guy on the shoulder and promised him it was all free, but the alchemist slipped back on purpose and said he'd pay for everything anyway. Edgar asked Vacant if he planned to join the Adventurers Guild, the easiest way for a traveler to pull in money, but the kid just stared back, stunned like, Adventurers, who are they? The tavern owner jabbed a finger through the window at a huge building and yelled, "That's the guild," then told me to sign up there at least once, just in case. According to the archives, the aventurists are the closest thing this era has to alchemists, and yeah, they're probably raking in cash by whatever means it takes. Determination blazing, the legendary alchemist, who'd been asleep for 500 years, strode toward that towering building, and Ophidianta, grateful to the core, simply lifted her hand and waved him on. The alchemist strode up to the bridge that opened the way to the guild, banners snapping overhead, a watchtower looming high, and a facade so beautiful it practically screamed power, because alchemy isn't what it used to be, and something far worse is brewing. The first-generation alchemist stared in disbelief, realizing he'd slept for 521 years, and now he was trapped in the middle of a roaring crowd of tough, heavily armored brutes, armor that screamed how brutally strong they were. He always tried to keep his head down and avoid trouble, but the moment he stepped into the guild, a pack of men closed in, glaring with pure disdain and open aggression. Lost, totally thrown off, just lifted his hands like, "I'm sorry," and blurted out what was wrong with him, why he caused everyone to react like that. Just an hour ago, the boy strode across that bridge straight for the guild, full of grit and confidence. Now he's on the edge of what's waiting beyond those gates. With his heart full of awe, he stared at it from the inside, and Zosmos, bursting with curiosity, shot out too, flying around to get a closer look. Candelabras gleamed above, casting warm light across a grand hall with at least 2 floors. Downstairs was packed with tables and benches, and the whole place buzzed with all kinds of people. The adventurers dove into the celebration, laughing as they drank and stuffed themselves, drinks crashing onto the floor and food flying everywhere, yet nobody even blinked. Vaken was buzzing with anticipation, dying to see all the wild things this place had in store, until his thoughts got yanked apart by a sudden voice calling his name. A hard-faced warrior jabbed his finger at the hero and barked that this place wasn't meant for little kids like him. Then again, it was only natural, since he was getting called out by a veteran adventurer, Beowulf. Still smiling, Bacon laid out his story. He'd come from a faraway land, and someone told him to chase work here. But Beowulf didn't like that one bit. He flashed a grin and shot back, "So that's why you want to be an adventurer." With that same kind smile still on his face, the guy kept staring down the stern warrior, whose expression wavered between sheer confusion and blazing anger, making him look even more terrifying. The warrior didn't even hesitate. He snapped around, jabbed his finger at the reception desk, and motioned the boy to chase after him. The other adventurers burst into laughter. There was Beowulf again, stuck babysitting the newbie like it was his favorite job, and while everyone kept laughing, the veteran ignored it all and called Shirley to register the newbie. Shirley, this gorgeous girl, burst into applause, grinning at Beowulf and the newcomer, and introduced herself as the Adventurers Guild administrator. Shirley invited War to join them, but he snapped back, refusing, because he'd been chasing the adventurer life forever. Then he slammed a heavy hand onto Vaken's shoulder and declared he'd be one of them too. The administrator flashed a warm, genuine smile and welcomed the brand new arrival to their famous Adventurers Guild. The alchemist fumbled, scratched his head, and admitted he had zero clue who these adventurers were or what they even did. Then he scrambled to set the record straight and demanded a proper, detailed explanation. Shirley and Beowulf locked eyes, and in that instant it hit. His questions weren't just off, they were setting off alarm bells. A new pair of acquaintances swallowed their screams when they saw the alchemist, and the veteran jabbed a trembling finger at him, yelling how he'd dare show up here with zero clue about adventurers, while the first-generation alchemist stumbled through excuses, insisting he came from some far-off, remote place. While Beowulf tried to figure out where the guy came from, tribe or jungle, the administrator cleared her throat on purpose, grabbed everyone's attention, and braced herself to explain everything. Adventurers are the folks who jump on whatever quests the guild throws at them, grab rewards for every job they choose, and that's exactly how the girl explained it. Now it's crystal clear. These guys are the ultimate jacks of all trades in a world left empty, and it all traces back to alchemists. As the boy tried to absorb everything he'd just heard, Beowulf jabbed a finger at the job waiting for him and told the newcomer to watch closely and study hard. Beau picked the job of tracking down a huge, deadly beast that was still burning with rage. Then the ad slid in with its photo, and that terrifying image hit like a warning slap. Vaken started reading, and the beast didn't waste a second. It terrorized the locals and stalked the western forest, but before he could finish the page about the reward, time ran out. The adventurer had already herded his crew together, then promised the newcomer, "Don't even bother counting your cut, I'm taking care of it." Beowulf and the team would get every reward first, and only after that, they'd go have a blast. The alchemist stared in shock, He never expected an entire crew to get dragged onto a mission, so after a quick rethink, he swapped onto a different job instead. Shirley then stepped in to clear the confusion. The vacant class, was it a mage or a warrior? With a grin and a booming voice, he declared himself vacant Ord, an absolute legend alchemist. Shirley stared at him in total shock, and the whole crowd of adventurers snapped into a cold, disdainful silence, like the air itself turned heavy. As the adventurers huffed in irritation, Vaken stood there totally clueless, with zero clue why everything was hitting so hard. The administrator fumbled out 3 lame announcements and swore those were the only jobs for alchemists. While the crowd burst into laughter, he still looked totally lost, because how on earth could there be so few? The more they chatted, the more crushing disappointment spread through the alchemist's chest, and the clueless adventurers kept debating who even bothered with alchemy these days, like they couldn't possibly get it, especially since the guy clearly came from far-off lands. No one had a real answer for why alchemists got shoved to the sidelines, and the thought of asking it out loud scared me, because I didn't want to look like an idiot for nothing. After digging through the ads, Vekin shot Shirley a confident grin and shoved one sheet into her hands. This job was the one he was going to nail. The administrator warned him that making a healing potion from the order wouldn't be easy, but then she told him the newcomer had a whole week to master every last tricky detail. Suddenly, Vaken got boxed in from every direction by a swarm of adventurers. One even slung an arm around his shoulder, and the whole crowd erupted in laughter and insults, heckling the guy to finish the useless support they were sure didn't matter. When the alchemist, totally baffled, demanded why they were spouting all that nonsense, the crowd erupted in laughter, roasting this kid as if he was clueless. 2 mages stepped into the spotlight, flashing their magic like a flex, then grinned with total confidence and declared that magic and miracles settle everything now, and that mages and clerics are the best support classes. After their grand speeches and loud self-praise, they sneered that they didn't think the newcomer could do much, then admitted the only thing he'd proven was this: he brewed useful potions and handed them over to them, and that was all they felt he could manage. Totally lost, Bacon blurted out whether magic and miracles were really nothing more than magical and divine power, and Ken just nodded back, confirming it. Then the alchemists convinced themselves they could fix everything only right there, for a blink of time, and they refused to use universal potions they could have brewed anytime. Everything finally clicked, and that spark lit the hero up, because that's why adventurers banded together in groups. Trying to go solo only left them riddled with weak spots and open vulnerabilities. But those words didn't spark joy at all. They trapped the guy. He got boxed in from every side until he was basically pinned to the wall, with no way out. Raging warriors shrieked so hard the whole building, and way past it, echoed their fury, and it made no sense. How could an alchemist talk like that when Vacant should have kept his thoughts locked up? But that furious crowd of adventurers would not back down. They kept shouting that alchemists' tricks are useless compared to magic and miracles, then demanded the guys just brew their potions quietly and mess with pebbles. Vakenord felt crushed. How could alchemy have rotted this badly in the 500 years he'd been gone? A few days back, he'd run into that street merchant selling low-quality healing potions, and yeah, that was the bar for quality now. The alchemists, they were stuck in the absolute worst situation imaginable. Reality crushed his hopes. He truly believed alchemy would surge to unheard-of heights, then spill secrets nobody had ever seen, secrets with the power to flip the world. The guy snapped around on the spot, stared everyone down with a grim look, then marched straight toward the administrator as the crowd's furious shouts and outrage crashed all around him. He dropped a box of healing potions on the counter and demanded where to hand them over, while the same crowd that was just cursing him and glaring in anger now stood there totally baffled. Shirley gasped, asking where all that potion even came from, because the alchemist swore he only took the order, yet somehow the whole box had been prepared days ahead, packed with his own secret plan. The adventurers still wouldn't cool off. They couldn't wrap their heads around it, because those potions are notoriously brutal to brew. Then one of them snatched the bottle straight from the vacant and barked that it was only carbonated bottled water. The alchemist didn't even flinch. He was sure his potion would win. Then he grabbed the bottle, stared into it, and completely froze. The liquid inside was insanely beautiful, glowing with a bright, shimmering color that lit up the whole room. After checking it over, he swore this potion wouldn't do a thing, but with the crowd roaring and laughing behind him, he gulped down the strange medicine fast, eager, and shameless. In the next heartbeat, shock hit his face. Then power exploded through him, a brutal surge that swallowed his body like the energy was about to burst out in a raging storm. The medicine worked like a miracle. His long-lost finger came roaring back to life, like it had never left in the first place. The warrior's hands shook as he stared at them, stunned. He couldn't tell if he'd slipped into a dream or got hit by reality, because he'd never seen a potion like this before. He bolted to the alchemist, desperate to know how he'd brewed that potion, and Vakin just stared at him in shock, then tossed out the question that made his stomach drop. What if it would have been better if that finger hadn't grown back? The adventurer shook his head, bit hard on his lip, and tried to stop the tears, only for them to betray him and spill down his cheeks anyway. He snapped into tears like a kid and lunged for a hug that fell on empty air. Turns out that guy used to be a hunter. When he lost his finger, he got forced to switch classes, but now he's back, drawing a bow again like nothing ever happened. The other adventurers went silent, staring as the newcomer poured out his gratitude, then announced the healing potion was special, so powerful it could cure any affliction. A suffocating silence slammed into the room like heavy fog, and every adventurer just froze, tongues locked, breath caught, because nobody saw this coming. Every single adventurer snapped around like they'd been told to, then bolted straight for the administration desk, crashing into each other, tumbling to the floor, and kicking up a cloud of dust. As the crowd finally quieted, Shirley took a shaky breath and called out to the empty room. Then the demand for healing potions exploded, so she slammed a stack of papers onto the table. Vakin let out a shaky, heavy breath. This wasn't what he wanted, not even close, but maybe it was for the best, until the flood of orders hit him like a punch and made him freeze. The crowd started buzzing again, and that sound snapped the alchemist's attention. What was happening this time? Those once raging men pressed their palms together like hungry wolves, staring at the alchemist's potions they'd ordered to drink, eyes blazing, ready to snap at the moment's notice. It all screamed right across their faces. Zosimus stood there, utterly baffled, because he couldn't make sense of how everything had spiraled into this. Vakinord lifted his head with pure swagger, thinking, this is it, my moment to prove I've got real alchemy in my bones. After a while, he wiped the sweat off his face, slammed another box of potions onto the table, and yep, this looked like the final one. Just when he thought he was done, Bacon snatched up every last back one again, too fast to even blink. Heavy footsteps pounded right at the guild entrance, impossible to ignore, and every head in the room snapped toward the doors as someone stepped forward, slow, steady, and locked in with pure determination, until the whole place leaned in, hungry for what came next. It was a beaten, wounded Beowulf, his armor soaked in blood, his hands and even his head dripping as pain screamed through him, and he held it all back by grinding his teeth. Bacon, shaken to the core by how wrecked Bo looked, blurted out at once, "What the hell happened to the war that put you in this state?" The alchemist stared at Beowulf in shock as he stumbled into the guild. Every step screamed exhaustion, blood spilled everywhere, and he dragged himself along with a massive sword strapped to his back. The newcomer stared in shock, unable to figure out what happened to that veteran adventurer, and he couldn't wrap his head around how it even went down. He looked fearless, and even after they had to run from a monster way stronger than they expected, he refused to stay down. He'd take a quick breath, then rush right back into the fight to back up his comrades. Vakin ripped out one of the healing potions he'd just passed around the whole guild and pressed it into Beowulf's hands. Grinning like he'd just won, the brand new adventurer bragged that he'd brewed the potion with his own hands. Then the warrior chugged it in one hard gulp, convinced it couldn't possibly get any worse. That potion's power hit him harder than he ever dreamed, and in the blink of an eye, a savage surge of strength and energy flooded his whole body. His wounds were totally healed, like the desperate fight he'd bolted from never even happened, so he stared in shock at the spot where blood was pouring just minutes ago. As Beowulf spun around to ask the alchemist how he'd pulled it off, the newcomer was already boxed in by a circle of dazzled onlookers, cheers and applause crashing down on him, so hard it left him blushing, awkward, and painfully aware of every single pair of eyes. The warrior was still trying to wrap his head around what just happened, but he couldn't help feeling relieved, because Vacant stole the spotlight, and his potion actually mended his wounds and brought back every ounce of strength he lost in the fight. He turned to rush back and back up his comrades, but the alchemist jerked him to a stop, then planted a stubborn look on his face and shoved a few bottles into his hands, swearing they'd be exactly what he'd need. The veteran took the help, spun away with a wave, and swore that when he came back, they'd clink cups together to celebrate the win, while Zosimos could only pray the warrior could handle that monster. The assistant also uncovered faint signs of the sage's tower, pointing straight toward the western forest, where monsters are battling and blood is flying right now. Vacant Orid's eyes lit up. This is huge. With the sage's tower, he can move in like it's his home and stash all his alchemy gear and tools inside too. Just as the guy strutted toward the guild exit like he owned the place, Shirley stepped in front of him, shutting down the alchemists, "I'm leaving" plan and promising he wasn't going anywhere. It was crystal clear Shirley had made up her mind. She leaned toward the terrified, blank-faced guy and demanded to know if he'd actually read the guild's license agreement after just joining. After getting that brutal no, the administrator decided it was time to pull the newly minted adventurer aside and lay down every rule and regulation for this place, right then and there. The guild runs on a brutal ranking ladder, 10 at the bottom, 1 at the top, and every quest gets handed out based on where you stand, with members allowed to take tasks only within their current rank, so you're always matched with missions that fit your skills and experience. Vaken's stomach dropped when he learned he'd been assigned rank 10, so he couldn't even tag along with Beowulf's team to hunt dangerous monsters, and Shirley was dead set on it. An alchemist had no business on the front lines. The administrator spread a stack of orders in front of him and made it crystal clear. Pick anyone you want, just not anything else. With a bright smile, the girl grabbed the top sheet of paper, leaned in like she was dying to see what it said, and tried to yank the newcomer's attention her way. When Shirley finally saw it wasn't working, she crept up behind him, jabbed his shoulder, and murmured into his ear, "If I drink from you, who knows? I just might end up falling in love." Caught off guard by that brutal pressure, he bolted straight for the exit, fleeing the threats, while the girl behind him just grinned like it was all part of the show. And while Shirley smirked like she just pulled off the perfect move, Vaken had already sprinted straight into the western forest. No matter how hard the alchemist tried to steer him, the girl's pleading didn't land, and the guy, no pause at all, charged straight into the forest where the fight was raging. What doubts even had a chance here? If alchemical materials were real, Bacon had no business sitting on the sidelines. He couldn't afford to miss this kind of opportunity. Zosimo's finally clocked who his master really was, and yeah, it hinted he'd bolted from Shirley. Because honestly, for a guy who's already past 40, you'd think he'd have a girlfriend by now, but he just shrugs and claims that for a real researcher, women are secondary. The whole reasoning finally snapped into place when the alchemist burst into the battlefield, only to see the warriors fighting tooth and nail against evil monsters, except there were just way too many. Bacon swept the room with sharp focus, piecing together just how critical and brutal this situation really was. The whole situation felt hopeless. Beowulf fought the monster with everything he had, but his comrades started dropping, one after another, unable to keep standing. From behind the trees, the deadliest foe burst into view, the great magbeast, the lesser Tarrasque, and when it snapped its massive jaws open, a thunderous roar tore through the air, blasting away any cover as its razor-sharp teeth bared themselves for the kill. Zosimus tore through the archives and announced a brand new species, and Vaken's mind instantly raced, because the material he could pull from it was gonna be new too. Beowulf spotted the alchemist and snapped at him. What was he even doing here, acting like a beginner in a place like this? Because the monster is way too strong for that. The alchemist sank into his own thoughts, tuning out everything around him, his face turning calm, yet a sharp, ominous grimace kept crawling across it, casting a gloomy, mysterious shadow over him. Beowulf tried to stop him, but the moment was already gone, too late. Vaken just kept mumbling under his breath, talking materials and all the fresh new gear he could snag. The next second battle fever hit him, those storage holes snapped open again, and 4 gleaming stones popped out. Now tell me, where would the alchemists even start hunting for the monster's weak spot? The stones the boy gripped in his hands weren't just rocks. They carried secret weight and meaning, unique artifacts that personified the 4 main elements. Vaken didn't even let doubt linger. He snapped to the answer so fast it was like, forget thinking, just give it all up right now. Beowulf's crew stared with mouths gaping in pure shock as the alchemist hurled all 4 stones at the monsters with everything he had. Some got roasted alive and couldn't escape the flames, others froze solid in blocks of ice, and some were yanked skyward by the wind like a raging tornado, then slammed back down with a thunderous roar, while the rest took lightning straight to the face and didn't make it. The adventurers stood there, stunned, because this wasn't even magic, it was power buried in the objects themselves, and they'd never seen anything like it before. Vaken didn't even slow down, he kept hurling stones nonstop, and Beowulf and his crew barely managed to leap out of the way in time. Only after the whole clearing was littered with the carcasses of defeated monsters did the alchemist finally stop. Then those screams of agony faded away one by one, dissolving into thin air. The guy barely even had a breath to figure out what made those monsters weak. Turns out they were way too frail, and still, shock clung to the adventurers' faces. Chuckling to himself, the alchemist finally decided, yep, fire was the answer, and he didn't even notice how terrifying he looked right then, lost in his own thoughts as a sly, satisfied amusement took over. But now the warriors froze in pure terror the second he stepped in, because up close, he looked way more terrifying than they ever expected. Vaken snapped his head toward the last monster still standing, that same unsettling grin plastered on his face as he focused on it after draining his elemental stones. He planted himself inches from the colossal, roaring monster, no fear in his face, no flinch in his step, as if that brutal roar was just the opening bell to a fight he'd already chosen. Circles flared across the floor and beams of light burst out, boxing the alchemist in, so the real question hit him fast. What's this monster's weak spot, and how do you strike it? He came for the answers. From those glowing circles, magic swords of every element started bursting out, lights flashing like a warning. Vakin's face tightened. He stared hard, clearly hungry to find out what this massive monster could really do. Right then, the guy yanked out his magical alchemist staff and his trusty weapon from storage. As soon as he pulled it free, he swung hard and barked the order to start. Every blade he drew snapped its tip straight at the monster, poised to land a fight-ending strike. In the very next heartbeat, they both surged forward together, zipping off in the same direction at the speed of light. Dozens of swords crashed down on the tiny Tarrasque in the blink of an eye, and it could only roar in helpless, searing pain. But this monster wasn't as easy as they hoped. It still stood tall, unmoved, like it was daring them to try again, and that shift hit both the alchemist and the whole adventuring crew like a punch. The alchemist couldn't believe his plan wasn't working, and everyone watching went wide-eyed with total shock. With one brutal jerk, he severed the monster's head, taking out the leader and the very last one still standing. The giant carcass and its head smashed onto the ground with a brutal crash, blood gushing everywhere, as the monster finally went down for good. The adventurers just stared, mouths hanging open at every wild thing unfolding, and they couldn't stop asking, how in the world is an alchemist pulling this off, and at that age? And the worst part of it all, 500 years ago, the first generation of alchemists weren't even stuck in some lab brewing potions. They had to chase down materials themselves. And this monster was just another trophy for one of the deadliest alchemists, Vakin Orda. With a grin that never faded, he pulled out a sharp knife and sliced out the rare, valuable material he craved for his deadly experiments. Before long, Bacon was already inside the tavern, the dancing duck, settling in like he owned the place. Suddenly, a coin-filled bag slammed onto the table with a loud clank, and the coins burst everywhere, rattling the whole room. The alchemist snapped his gaze off his work and demanded what money Beowulf had just emptied, and Beowulf answered him. Turns out, it was the reward for smashing the lesser Tarrasque, even if all the boy had to show for it was the materials he'd gathered. The adventurer snapped his head back, like, trust me, earned rewards are the real rule, and he refused to back down. The warrior even struck a deal with the administrator, insisting Vakin was just a temporary participant, even if it wasn't his job, then shut down all objections, grabbed the money, and vowed to pour it into launching a new laboratory. While the guy was thanking Beowulf for the money, he couldn't help but get curious about what the alchemist was cooking. When Beowulf's question made him light up, he decided right then to show off his creation. Bacon was cooking up a stove that ditched wood altogether. Then he proudly showed it off with a whopping 40 temperature settings, built-in fire protection, and a heat-saving function. Beowulf was already dismissing those non-stop rumors about the one guy who just wanted to quit, letting the alchemist's wisdom stay in this tavern, until Theo barged in out of nowhere. And that's when the whole scene went dead silent, like a vacant cauldron. The girl beamed with pure joy, clutched her hands to her chest, and the moment she laid eyes on that incredible invention, her happiness surged like a spark. Seeing her reaction, the alchemist thrust his hands toward the stove and urged the girl to use his creation, sure she'd burst over and hug him in pure gratitude. Turns out the empty miscalculation wasn't about him at all. This joy wasn't for his work, it was for Beowulf. The girl swept up to him and demanded what he'd left behind here, and the alchemist's disappointment hit like a gut punch. The waitress, to the guy's utter annoyance, hovered around Beowulf and kept pushing him to grab a bite at the tavern, while Vakin, confused out of his mind, demanded to know how Theo even knew Beowulf. The girl looked him dead in the eyes and said he was the strongest adventurer in the whole city, so of course everyone already knew his name. The alchemist got hit with a total curveball and went completely baffled. Then he puffed out his cheeks, muttered something totally incomprehensible, and clearly grumbled about how insanely popular Beo was. Right now, nobody was buzzing about Beowulf, because the whole city was hooked on a shadowy alchemist with godlike power, and his potions could heal absolutely anything. Just after that, Beowulf and the Vikings charged straight for the Sullivan Adventurers Guild. Right as they reached the entrance, the place erupted. Everyone surged toward the alchemist, begging him to join their groups, and some even looked ready to throw down just to get him on the team and use his powers for their own plans. It all kicked off when rumors of the great alchemist, untouchable in knowledge and talent, spread at lightning speed, and even with dozens of offers flooding in, he shut every single one down. He burned with determination to open his own lab, turn his wild ideas into real projects, and he was ready to welcome anyone willing to lend a hand. Beowulf helped shove the restless crowd out of his way, steering everyone straight to Shirley's desk, and then boom, warriors and mages surged to the reception desk, desperate to drop off their requests. Turns out he didn't have the best intentions at all, so the adventurer slid the order out, then invited Vacant to team up for the mission. Beowulf flashed his most desperate, pleading face, praying it would sway Ken, but it looked like nothing he did even fazed him, because Ken stayed completely unshaken. The deal didn't mean the alchemist would be dragged into the Black Dogs, the veteran's crew's name. Right as the warrior was firing up, talking nonstop about what the mission really meant, an escort job that promised to get brutal, someone who just walked into the guild cut him off out of nowhere. The one who dared to pull this off was Vivi, the Black Dog's mage, and from the moment you saw him, it was crystal clear. He had zero plans to team up on a mission with an alchemist, and definitely not one this young. Vivi said, proud as ever, that if he'd been there with the Black Dogs when the monsters attacked, they would have handled the whole fight themselves, because a kid's help would just get in their way. As he closed in on Vacant, the mage glared like he could tear through the enemy's defenses with pure sight, and Vivi snapped with a sharp, booming order, telling the alchemist to get out of here immediately. The Black Dog's commander tried to calm the mage down, but the guy wouldn't hear a word. He just exploded, screaming he was sick to death of babysitting stupid, incompetent adventurers. Vivi spat that alchemists were the world's worst parasites, swung his magic wand, and launched a whipping whirlwind straight at Vacant. Luckily, the kid snapped into action and leapt out of the way at the last second. While everyone scrambled to calm the mage wrecking the guild, this guy just couldn't stop wondering why alchemists were hated in this world, and it crushed him every single time. Even with Vacant still offering Vivi a chance to talk and hash everything out, the magician didn't even plan to listen, because after he'd already torn through half the guild, it didn't matter. He and every other alchemist refused to carry the weight of the mirror space. Mirror space means there's a whole other world out there, an exact, point-for-point duplicate of our reality. Back in those days, alchemists were running massive experiments in their worlds, because their wild, dangerous weapons couldn't be properly tested anywhere else. And finally, Beowulf yanked the veil off the truth and laid bare what sparked Vivi's furious rage, because his older sister got caught in an accident and got trapped in the mirror space forever. The mage nodded at his commander's claim. Then the next second, they yanked his sister away, right as she barely cared about the Magic Academy, and they wasted no time firing up an artifact called Darby's Mirror and testing it on her. So this artifact got tossed out around 500 years ago. Then why on earth did it crawl back into this era? Rage kept climbing in Vivi. His sister wasn't coming back. She was trapped there forever, and not a single alchemist dared to take the blame, while the magician was already gasping for breath and still refused to stop. He kept swinging at the empty air, throwing himself into another strike, while he ranted about wiping every alchemist off the map. He clutched his hand with a death grip, yanking him back from the next round of blows. Even with rage practically blasting off his opponent, Vacant stayed ice calm, smiled right at Vivi, who was boiling with anger, and the alchemist decided he had to help him. Rage surged through the mage, because what could this kid possibly do? Vivi had spent his whole life training as a mage, all for one reason, finding his sister, and he'd learned the truth. Only the sacred bell of Fulcanelli could open that door. The adventurers only ever heard of this invention like it was straight out of fairy tales. So when Vivi realized it could only exist in legends, panic swallowed him whole, because he knew his little sister was doomed to stay there forever. If he could just get that spell, he'd drag his older sister back to life, right then. Yet the mage, crushed by grief, finally broke down, clutching his head as tears spilled and his heart shattered. While the other adventurers patted their comrade on the back, Bacon probably had a plan brewing. He smirked, then slipped his hand into his pocket. From that moment, he ripped out Fulcanelli's sacred bell, grinned, and pressed it into Vivi's hands. It felt like a cruel joke, not a real laugh. This magician had chased away to save his sister for years, and then the boy pulls it off in seconds, yanking a bell from his pocket like it's nothing, even though that bell shouldn't exist in this world. The alchemist swore it was the sacred bell of Fulcanelli, but Vivi, along with the commander of the Black Dogs, snapped with rage at the sound of it, convinced the claim was nothing but a cruel joke they couldn't afford in a situation like this. Then Viking whipped out a mirror, ready to prove a point, pull the ones trapped free, handle the mess when accidents hit, and that's how the sacred bell of Fulcanelli came to be. When the mirror space theory was first written down, creators spat out a bunch of wild artifacts that didn't quite work, and that's how accidents exploded. As Vacant got ready to unleash the mysterious artifact, he let out a hard breath, and the irritation and frustration clawed higher and higher inside him, because everything around him was pushing him over the edge. Back then, this spell was carved into every street corner, but when the Royal Academy, one of the finest schools around, can't crack what should be a simple problem, you've got to wonder why. He dove deeper into his own head, ringing that bell as he hunted the girl inside the mirror space. But one obsession wouldn't let go. Could he actually bring alchemy back to this world? The alchemist finally caught up to her, yanked her straight into this world, and the mirror exploded with blinding, soul-rattling light. The guy yanked his hand forward with all his strength, forcing the girl closer to this world. In the blinding glare, a girl's silhouette slowly rose from the mirror like she was surfacing out of nowhere, bursting into a breathtaking, dazzling glow. When the girl crash-landed into this world, the mirror exploded into razor-sharp shards, and they ricocheted through the room with a violent clatter, sparks flashing everywhere like the air itself was hiding a secret. A soft blush kissed her cheeks, and she looked like she'd drifted into deep sleep. Then a gentle breeze kicked up from the mirror's broken pieces, whipping her hair into wild, messy tangles. Everyone in that room froze. No one saw it coming. Then only Vacant grinned like a king because he'd pulled it off again. The girl slammed into her rescuer, but he caught her on instinct, ready for this exact twist, saving her from a nasty fall and any serious fallout. Vacant tells sopping Vavai, "I found your sister in the mirror world and saved her, but she's barely hanging on right now. Give her a full week of rest, and then she'll be able to live like before again." He shoved the girl into his sobbing brother's arms, and he couldn't wrap his head around how real this nightmare felt. Because long ago he'd given up on everything else, and all that burned in him now was revenge against every one of them he believed was guilty. Vavai couldn't hold it in. He just kept crying over and over, completely overwhelmed with the sweetest joy because he'd finally met his older sister, the one he'd missed for so long. The adventurers crowding the sidelines couldn't believe their eyes, touched, stunned, and on the edge of their seats, thinking, what else can they possibly do, and what wild surprise is he pulling next? The magician finally cracked under the weight of what he'd done, dropping to his knees and begging the young alchemist for forgiveness for his disrespect. And even over 40, he poured out non-stop gratitude and apologies. Vacant nodded at the job well done and just gave Vavai a soft, sympathetic smile. Beowulf suddenly burst into their tender moment, shouting that they were leaving tomorrow for the mission he'd mentioned earlier. A little later after that brutal day, the adventurers crashed into the dancing duck to catch their breath, and Fio looked straight up annoyed. She puffed her cheeks like a kid stomping her mood, then stared off with a resentful glare, daring him to finally react. Ken tried to tell them that Beo had basically dragged him along, but the girl just snorted, turned her back, and shut him down. How was he supposed to lie to her when he'd already promised he'd show up at her party tomorrow? One of the adventurers caught the moment and exploded into loud laughter. He'd never seen Fio like this. Turns out she really had a thing for the alchemist. Shame hit her hard, she bit her lip, but when Zosimo suggested they call it quits and retire, she couldn't bear the thought. The very next morning, the adventurers were already on the street, preps done, gear checked, and ready to dive straight into the task ahead. But just as the idol was about to take center stage, a shout tore through the moment, one that came from a man in glasses, Gazar, a scientist from the Royal Academy. And he wasn't calm for even a second. Rage and indignation burned in him because an alchemist joined the expedition, something he believed was absolutely, no exceptions, unacceptable. While Vacant awkwardly scratched his head, Beo kept pushing, insisting that bringing the alchemist along was the right move, and that one day, Vacant would thank him for never regretting it. Gazar clenched his teeth so hard they ached, rage boiling in his chest, as he snarled that nobody was going to treat him like some stupid, naive kid. Then he snapped that alchemists were just vulgar pseudo-competitors, not real scientists. The Cherpaniksov's captain swore they wouldn't leave without this guy. Then, sure enough, the scientist could hit the road alone, no escort needed. Zosimo nudged his master's head with shaky caution, trying to warn him about the premonition that this mission would turn deadly. Yet that same fear was exactly what made Ken say, "I'm going with Beo's team." We were on an escort mission to haul Professor Gazar into the ossuary tower, standing deep in the ruined lands by the Dunatek River basin, because once the rainy season's over, monsters swarm the place like they're already waiting. That place is way too dangerous to risk with a bunch of civilians, but after the rainy season hits, it's packed with fresh plants and seafood, and he can't help thinking he might snag something useful out there. He tried to talk the scientist down on the spot, insisting there was nothing to fear, and swore he'd never step in or disrupt his crucial research again. Gazar flicked his hand with pure annoyance like, do we really have to say something so obvious? In his mind, no mere alchemist could ever get in the way of his noble research. The cranky scientist barked that time was money and ordered him up to the cart. Then the alchemist let out a breath of relief, while Beo clapped a hand on his shoulder and marched after Gazar. The moment they'd all been waiting for finally exploded into action, and a crew of several people dashed off with pure hype, though right now, they've only scraped the surface of the route they swore to finish. Ken was chatting with his assistant, and man, it had been ages since they rode by cart. They'd leaned on fast teleportation way too much lately, and tonight he just wanted to kick back and breathe. Just as the talk was heating up, Oscar from the Black Dogs leapt out of the cart with a big grin, greeted Wayne, and practically lit up the moment by hoping they could team up and build some serious, productive cooperation. The man decided to ask Ken straight up if he was really cool with something so casual, since they both belonged to the same guild, because yeah, that meant they were friends and comrades. Oscar's sister, Miss Cal, snapped at him to stop slacking and keep his guard up since they were still working, while Vavi, right beside the Black Dogs, told the alchemist to chill for a moment. But Miss Cal was dead right. Zosmos snapped to his master that something was rolling in from the right side of the road, and Ken instantly shouted the warning to the Black Dogs, yet they still refused to veer off the road. Minutes later, the horse-drawn carriage got boxed in from every side as armed bandits swept in fast and moved as one. They demanded the kind of standard price people like them always asked for, something genuinely valuable and meaningful, while promising instant death to everyone packed inside that carriage, no exceptions. Terrified and totally lost, the scientist rushed for cover behind the fearless adventurers, only to see them fume with outrage at this shocking surprise meeting. The bandits cackled with cruel glee as the Black Dog team burst out of the cart, snapped into formation at once, and stood their ground to crush any threat and guard Gazar. While the scientists spiraled into panic, Beale was already cooking up battle tactics. He snapped his focus to Vakin and offered to take on two of them, but the alchemist was again trapped in his own head, shutting everyone else out. The guy kept insisting bandits hadn't changed a bit, that after 500 years all they ever did was rob and kill. Then Ken snapped his argument short and turned to Beowulf. Ken stared blankly for a moment, then finally blurted, "So, is it a crime if you put someone to sleep forever?" Beo was totally baffled, but the bandits, smug as could be, burst into laughter and charged the adventurers like, honestly, if you're scared of punishment, you don't even lift a weapon. Right when nobody saw it coming, Vakin snapped forward without hesitation, slam, a sudden blow, and he chopped the bandit's head off just as he lunged at him, sending blood splashing everywhere. The alchemist stood there, unshaken, saying he wasn't scared of a single punishment. He just needed to uncover the real worth of each life before him. The bandits went rigid, like their boots had fused to the earth. Ken felt the tension snap tighter and let out a heavy sigh. Great. It looked like he'd be fighting problems again. He thrust his staff at the bandits and roared that they'd better brace themselves, because their only move left was to pray, and if they didn't want to die, they should hit their knees and beg him for forgiveness 100 times. Gazar froze in shock, dropped on his butt, and trembled with raw fear, then blurted, "What is all this about?" The hero gripped his weapon as defeated enemies littered the ground around him, and not a single one moved. Vakin, still kinda stunned, blurted that he thought he'd rattled the professor, and then straight up asked how many people he should bring back to life, while the guy in the back kept trembling like pure terror. Zosmos strode up to Vakin and told him, "We might be able to bring them back," but Vakin just grimaced. What a cruel thought. And yeah, under the 30-minute rule, a person can be revived with secret potions, though whether that resurrection works depends on how the corpse is. His acquaintances insisted he'd made himself stand out again, but they all agreed he was a good guy, so he even brushed it off, and when it was time, he apologized to them and promised he'd switch up his approach next time. After a while, their carriage finally lurched forward, and they rolled across the plains, while Gazar kept shaking with terror, clamping down on his lower lip like he was trying to hold himself together. The protagonist apologized for going a little too far, and the other guy shrugged it off. Aristocrats were always cowards, never lifting a finger themselves, just sinking into chairs. Zosmos cut in right then. He snapped his attention to Vakin, calling him Lord, and announced that the task he'd ordered was finally done. The main character thanked him, and the assistant just waved it off, saying he was too kind. Right then, the enemies snapped back to their senses. Zosmos roared that they should have come alive, then dug right into their heads, and he didn't think they'd end up turning into bandits. They tried to stop him from saying it, because once someone made a mistake, they don't just stop there, they go and do it again. In his time, he couldn't stop thinking about how people kept sparking wars again and again, using alchemist-forged weapons to tear each other apart. Even the bandits rolled in with alchemists' weapons, and that's when he realized his big, naive mistake. Still, he shoved the cart forward and kept driving. The protagonist sank into his thoughts, and a heavy sadness spread across his face as he counted every mistake he'd made so far. At the same time, the commander spun toward the professor and demanded whether he understood why they'd brought the empty seats along. He nodded yes. Then the guy leaned in and warned, "You're not there yet. Buckle up, because you've got a long road ahead." During the rainy season, the streets flood so hard they can't keep rolling by carriage, so they ditch their vehicle and press on by foot. And just when they think it's bad enough, a giant crab monster crashes into the scene, and they all jump in to fight it. After they clear the last enemy, a gigantic slime comes barreling at them, and right after that, massive water insects swarm the path, making the whole scene look absolutely terrifying. The moment night drops, a swarm of skeletons crawls out, closes in on everyone, and turns the whole fight into a brutal, desperate struggle. To grab victory, our main character fires up his weapon. Then a massive energy barrier explodes out and blasts every enemy down, and the professor's jaw drops in total shock. The man got asked again if he was glad they brought the main character along, and the anger already started bubbling as he snapped that he knew just how cool he was. While the other guy warned him, the worst problem was still waiting around the corner. The rainy season rolls in, and thick fog swallows the place, so they can't go anywhere. Everyone just agreed to wait it out by grabbing a bite. Gizar said, "Stop talking like that, speed up." And they went, "You really think we don't know you're in a rush?" He shot back, "Now we have to move faster." And they explained they were only worrying about his safety. Then the man grinned and said, "We're adventurers, we'll figure something out." One more man stepped aside and said the professor was totally consumed by his work. Bacon even challenged him, asking if research was worth all that obsession, and they admitted it. The professor was digging into the history of magic, and yeah, he was genuinely hooked. After a while, they finally stumbled on a brand new site, a tower turned ossuary. Relief hit hard because they'd made it at last, and right then, the protagonist felt it in his bones. This had to be the ruins of the Tower of the Sages. The team snapped to the professor and warned, "Monsters could be up ahead, don't sprint in." Then they demanded, "You got it." Gazar shot back, "What are you talking about? I don't have time for this." He had to crack the tower's mystery fast and earn a spot in the academy, so he bolted toward the facility right away, while everyone else just muttered about the chaos he was causing, and Vaken couldn't figure out why he never seemed to get a breather. So someone finally told Vaken that this tower vanishes the second the rainy season is over. No one has a clue why. Vaken nodded like he got it, then thought to himself that maybe the Tower of the Sages still has a few tricks left running. Is this fog really crawling through this place and sinking into the tower like bones, smothering everything except knowledge? The protagonist whipped around to Zosimo's and snapped, "I've started acting." And Zosimo's shot back, "Good, I'm starting to restore the archive." Bacon stared at the wreckage and swore it was all that was left of Donate's old water city, where art and tourism once thrived. Now nothing but pathetic ruins. Busted walls, toppled pillars, and no building standing. A heartbeat later, the protagonist suddenly sensed the currents in the air. Zosimo's called out to him, and Vaken admitted he felt something was off, right there in the atmosphere. Then his assistant urged, "Time to retreat." The main character said Nushi lived here a long time ago, and if he's still here after 500 years, that spells nothing but trouble. Vaken's eyes locked on the monster ahead, razor-focused, but his nerves were screaming because he knew this fight wasn't going to be easy. The main crew yelled at BO to get out, right now, because a massive monster was closing in fast. The men snapped, "Is this your premonition again?" And when Bacon looked that scared, they knew it had to be deadly. He even warned them that if anyone spotted them, it would turn dangerous fast. They shouted for Oscar, and this Colon stepped in, demanding they back off because they were getting ready to retreat. The professor snapped and started roaring at them for talking nonsense, and one of the escorts shot back, asking if he still didn't get what mattered right now. Bale demanded to know what was wrong with Gizar, and the protagonist smugly thought, "I'm a researcher, of course I can read him." Then Zosimo snapped back, "No time, this monster will be here any second." At that exact moment, the donut deathworm burst back out from the ground, blasting chunks of the surface into the air as dust and debris scattered everywhere. Everyone watching froze in shock at this giant monster roaring to life. Everyone in the room started screaming that they'd never laid eyes on creatures like this before. Someone even called them filthy. And just when the huge monster wasn't bad enough, tiny worms crawled in too. Bacon then snapped that those were his children, so watch out. He also said they're absolutely ravenous, ferocious in every way, and there are over 100 of them. We've got to ditch the mud and the water right now and get out of here. His friend shot back, "Can we even handle this at all?" And right after that, he turned and called out to the professor. The bald man blurted that Geyser had bolted from the monsters straight toward a battered, dangerous-looking building, and everyone gasped in shock, begging to know what was going on. Zosimo's admitted that if things went down in a fight, it would have been smarter for him to stick with them, but instead he panicked and ran, and he knew that choice was poison. The protagonist nodded along, then felt it hit his chest. He couldn't just abandon Zosimo's to die. His conscience wouldn't let him. Vaken clenched his fist and snapped that he had no choice, until a voice behind him cut in, saying the truth. He wasn't facing it because he had to, he was scared. Turns out it was his friend, the commander, who stepped up and demanded if he truly wanted to bet his life on someone who tossed his escorts aside like they didn't matter, and he snapped back that they were leaving right now. So the protagonist told him, "You're kinda dry," and Zosmos fired back, "That's a brilliant call for a commander," while Vaken swore, "I'll handle everything solo." The main character yanked his voice up and screamed at them to sprint to the tower and the ossuary. He was about to unleash dangerous artifacts, and everyone was stunned speechless. A tiny magic seal blinked into the protagonist's hands, and he went dead serious, promising he'd crack exactly what to do with that creature. The commander demanded what he planned to do by himself, and the other man just laughed it off as impossible, until Vaken pressed again, insisting they hear him out. His friends warned him, "Don't even think about dying. If it gets too hot, bolt." And as they made a path, they wiped out the worm's young. Zosmos said Bayo had already mapped out a retreat route for him, like they were comrades for real, and the protagonist nodded, saying it looks like that's exactly what's happening. Then Vaken snapped his focus to the monster, shouted that he'd be his opponent, grabbed an artifact loaded with handheld explosive missiles, and charged in for the attack. Almost right away, he hurled the artifact at his enemy, yelled for him to catch it, and the impact landed perfectly. He reported the hit, and the other guy erupted with pure joy until the world flipped on him. That worm starts slurping air through its mouth, then lunges at him with wild fury, totally blindsiding the protagonist, who snaps and curses at the top of his lungs, just as the beam locks onto him. The commander and the crew erupted in shouts of his name, because nobody knew what was happening to him, just one grim Viking silhouette cutting through the smoke. In just a few heartbeats, the smoke vanished like the protagonist had yanked away an invisible curtain, revealing Phania silks, a razor-thin magical thread that turns rock solid the moment it hits. Vaken admitted he didn't have much of it, so he had to play it smart. Then he ditched the usual plan and chugged the hero's potion, and boom, it supercharged his physical power way beyond normal. Then he hurled the potion bottle over his shoulder with zero hesitation, refused to look back, and slammed out, "All right, this is where the battle begins." He started circling the monster like he was hunting prey, and it hit him with insane speed. Then the worm snapped forward and blasted its beam again, but he whipped aside and dodged it clean. Turns out Bacon pulled his trick, and the worm's body exploded. His friends were blown away, especially after he told them to back off, and the professor immediately asked, "So that's the alchemist's power?" The hero felt the defense was rock solid, damage barely even slipped through. Maybe if he didn't have to finish this fight, it would have stayed that way, but was he really going to force it to happen? Zosmos asked how he could help, and Vaken snapped back that the only thing that mattered was keeping the weaklings far away from him. His assistant nodded and said he understood. Then, out of nowhere, his cubic body ignited with a blinding glow, and those scorching rays split outward and blasted straight into the worm's children. With the enemies wiped out, Vacant demanded answers. When did Zosmos learn magic? He smirked and said, "Because of me, you finished your training," then leaned in like he had something incredible just for him. A tiny dark sphere started forming in the protagonist's hands, and as he kept holding it steady, he bolted away from the worm's snapping spikes, yet one of them still slashed his face. Rage crashed through him as he muttered to himself, then he hucked the sphere at the worm without warning, and right after, he snapped, "All set." Vaken didn't blink for a single second, then boom, the whole world burst into smoke. A second later, the smoke vanished, and boom, everything went ice cold, even that monster. Those weren't random drops at all, they were icy particles. And the artifact, with the molecules swirling around it, it drags the world down to absolute zero. Everyone started bombarding him with questions. How did everything flip in a single moment? Zosmos said they had to stack up a ton of artifacts, and he doubted that Vacant would even need ice drops. He shut his eyes, yanked out his weapon, and snapped that there was no stopping them. The enemy meant business, yet somehow they crushed him without losing a single person. Vacant hurled his staff straight at the worm, and the impact smashed it into a spray of tiny pieces. Every man froze in disbelief at what he pulled off. Then the broken worm shattered and rained down in even more pieces, and the main character stood right amid the wreckage. Bacon grinned so wide his face looked red, clutching a magic stone in his hands. Then he said the one they'd pull from that worm could be worth far more, and the hunger to build burned in his eyes like the whole world had suddenly burst into bright, blazing color. The professor called him by name, and when the hero spun around, joy burst out of him. He was alive. The man just nodded and said alchemists really could pull off miracles like that. Bacon shot back that this isn't some better vs worse contest. Alchemists can do way more than you think. The professor grinned and said he'd finally opened his eyes, then thanked him like that moment mattered most, while everyone else froze in shock because nobody saw it coming. Gazar stared at the ice gold sculptures and muttered that demon King Talos, who'd cracked every secret of magic, never expected to lay eyes on something like this. The protagonist suddenly caught a name he didn't recognize, yet it felt weirdly familiar, like something he'd heard long ago back when it was 500 years earlier, and he simply couldn't remember it. Bio whipped around to Bacon and demanded what they were doing next, but Bacon stared back like, "What are you even talking about?" Then he turned the spotlight on the real problem, what they should do with the report for the guild. Right then the main character snapped back that everything was a total disaster, and in his gut he knew Beowulf had been dead on, because a monster erupted out of nowhere, something nobody had ever seen, and the alchemist instantly swept it aside. Bacon figured that once they uncovered it, the next thing he'd get would be a summons to come straight to the royal capital. A brand new day dawned, and with every fight finally over, they headed back into the city. Right then, a voice shouted the protagonist's name, asking for just a minute, and he spun around instantly. The cape-wearing guy barked that they'd been hearing vacant from every direction lately, and the other guy froze, demanded who he even was, and the cape guy just pressed the question again. Then he smirked and told him, "My name's Tarask," and unlike that other guy, he was just a plain alchemist. The protagonist's mind flashed back to his earlier run-ins with this guy, and when he claimed he was only using moose, the cheapest ingredients he could find, those memories hit him hard, and unease crawled over his skin. Vaken told Tarask he landed his job thanks to him, then shot him a real thank you. Right after that, Tarask snapped that now everybody's talking about him. The guy flashed a sly grin and said he only wanted to grill their new rising star with questions, so the main character snapped back, "Yeah, but what questions exactly?" And Tarask's face instantly twisted. Tarask shot his hand out toward him and asked, "So, how do you see this world?" Vaken froze, totally stunned, and couldn't find a single word to answer. The protagonist snapped that he had no clue what the question even meant. Then Tarask shrugged and said he just wanted the alchemist's take. Vaken couldn't shake the sting of it, like him, an alchemist watching their kind get treated like scraps, because the old alchemy culture had crumbled and magic was exploding instead, and he hated every second of it. But the main character can't stand how he's looking at him, and it's way too close for comfort. Bacon started shaking his hands like he was making a point, insisting he wasn't so different from him, just doing the best he could, and Tarask couldn't believe what he was hearing. After that, the guy pressed him, "Are you sure you want to say you've got no complaints?" And the main character nodded hard, swearing everything was totally fine. Tarask flashed him a sweet smile, but inside he was already thinking, "I still haven't gotten through to you." Then he spoke out loud, saying the alchemists always do just one thing, only for the guy to snap back, asking what he meant. The main character smirked softly, then said in a calm voice that with alchemy, they'd forge a better future. Then Vaken grinned at Tarask, asked if he felt the same, and declared that every alchemist was chasing the very same goal. Hearing that, he turned red and went speechless for a second, but then the guy grinned and said the vacant was spot on. Everything was exactly like that, and they'd all been fighting to build a better future. Tarask spun around to leave, lined in on Vaken, and told him he'd had a dream and one day he'd share it with him. Vaken thanked him for the talk, and honestly the protagonist didn't see that coming. He froze, blank, not knowing what to say. Zosimos leaned in and demanded what he planned to tell him, and Vaken just admitted word for word that he had absolutely no idea at all. Then he blurted that the guy reminded him of his old alchemist buddies, and the assistant nodded, saying he was basically a little vacant, bursting with eccentric vibes. The other one snapped back, "That's rude, we can't lump you in the same row." After what felt like forever, the main character gripped an envelope in both hands, eyes wide with disbelief. Then he blurted out, "Wait, did I really get an invitation?" Sweet Shirley and the guild snapped along with his words, then declared this invitation came straight from His Majesty and the Royal Academy of Sciences. The main character just flashed an indifferent look, said he didn't care, and demanded she toss it aside. Then she snapped back that it was impossible. She kept talking, saying you can't just turn down the king's invitation, and he shot back, "I'm only some lowly little adventurer, so why should I even get what you people want from me?" Shirley shot back that she couldn't believe some tiny adventurer could take down a legendary monster that hadn't shown up since the country was founded, so that's exactly why he got the invitation. Vacant simply sighed. Right then he was hemmed in by other adventurers, all buzzing the same rumor. He'd pulled off another insane feat, and they said he even got invited to the capital. And getting to sit with the king in person, that was the real, mind-blowing privilege. Zosimos said it all looked exactly like the professor had described him back in the capital. Then Bacon snapped, recognized his face, and nodded along with the assistant. Then he whipped his gaze back to Shirley and flat out said he wasn't going anywhere near the capital. Could he really refuse? Shirley snapped back that he couldn't, and she'd see to it. they'd cover his carriage and his hotel in the capital. The girl added that if he kept talking, they'd haul him off in a carriage with iron bars, and Bacon snapped back, "That's how criminals get shipped," realizing there was no point fighting anymore. Then he pressed Shirley again. Did the invite include anyone who came with him? She snapped back that she'd cover lodging for every person he brought, and even bodyguards weren't out of reach. After what felt like forever, the protagonist finally stepped out into the city, staring ahead like his mind was racing a mile a minute. Zosimo's leaned in and demanded what he was thinking. Bacon grinned and said he'd turn this mess into a trip with Theo, because lately, he'd already ditched his promise to show up at that party. Zosimo's admitted it was insanely tricky, and the main character snapped back that there was one catch, so the assistant stared at him right away, like, "Wait, what's the real issue?" running through his head. The protagonist admitted he'd never taken a girl on an adventure, and Zosimo's shot back that he was a virgin. Then Vakin shrugged him off and said he had an idea. He laid out a flawless game plan for his assistant, 6 steps to get that girl to take a trip with him, starting with one thing. He'd crank the vibe into something perfect, and Bacon was absolutely fired up about it. The protagonists were sure this would all feel normal, totally not weird, and they were convinced it was the perfect plan. After a while, the protagonist finally made it to Theo. She beamed at him, said his name like it was music, and started to celebrate his return. Then her words just vanished into thin air. Vakin lunged up to her, grabbed her shoulders tight, and blurted that they had to hit the road together, right now. The girl froze, stunned, and only managed to ask him again. After a while, the main character erupted in a scream, yanked his hands to his head, and swore because his flawless plan had collapsed. Zosimo's backed him up, calling it an outright disaster. Theo stood there, totally lost, staring at the chaos. After a few days, they finally hit the road together. She couldn't contain her excitement, calling out to him that the next town had a hot spring waiting. With a grin, the main character asked her if it was really true. Then he cut it short and said they should go grab the materials they need for alchemy. Zosimo spun toward him and said they were actually having fun on the trip to the capital, and the other guy admitted he was genuinely relieved. Then he suddenly remembered Theo's reaction, and her father's too. Vakin told Edgar, "You gave me the okay," so gratitude surged through him, and then he added, almost like a dare, that maybe he should thank the king too for accepting this invitation. The protagonist let out a breath, and Zosimo's warned that an invite from King Celery, 5 centuries ago, would have been a total disaster. Vakin's mind snapped back to the past at once. When they invited him to meet the king of his day, pride surged through his chest like fire. But in the end, all they talked about was cash and dirty politics, and the king turned out to be a total bore. His so-called alchemy plans only managed to piss him off. The aristocrats huddled around him were identical clones, seeing alchemy as nothing more than a tool to line their own greedy pockets. The protagonist dug into that memory, and right then, disgust hit like a punch, clean and brutal, and he's never forgotten it since. Theo snapped out his name and called to him, asking if he was really listening. Then she hit him with it, the hot springs of beauty. He shot back, "Of course I listened to you," and the girl smirked, "Say what you want, but the real magic starts when you go deeper. If she dives in, she'll pull in a mountain of clients." The main character stared forward, grinned, and said Theo was already ridiculously cute. Then the girl went wide-eyed in shock. In his head, Wyken fixated on one truth: women chase beauty like it's instinct, and 500 years ago the world practically ran on beauty serums and potions. Maybe he should whip up some for Theo too, and the moment he thought it, Theo's face instantly flared red with pure embarrassment. The protagonist leaned in and asked if she was seasick. Then he frowned and muttered how weird it was, because the potion he brewed for her was supposed to hold its power for another whole day. Theo flashed a smile and insisted she was totally fine, because the compliment nearly made her heart leap out of her chest, and he told her that if she needed more potion, he could have it to her in about 30 minutes, but he still wouldn't recommend it. Zosimo shot up to the girl and demanded she forgive her master's dumb lack of sensitivity. She just burst out laughing and said it was still the same as Ken. The assistant shot closer to the main character and snapped that she really needed to know one thing: he wouldn't just waltz into a new place and throw compliments at her like that. The main character stood his ground and swore he was speaking nothing but the truth. Plus, Theo is seriously adorable, the kind who could totally become a model. Then Zosimo's grilled him about what he meant by cute, and he snapped back that he had no real standards for what counts as female beauty. What matters to him most is that expressive face, cherry-red lips, a soft, gentle gaze, warm brown eyes, and hair that shines like sunbeams. Our hero still has a ton to say, but what he shares, and how fair it all is, might hinge on who's standing in front of him, because with Theo involved, you'd better believe he's not exactly neutral. Vakin admitted he was totally drawn to her, so he couldn't judge her fairly. Then he rubbed his chin and broke into a soft smile, saying, "If I call Fio cute, then yeah, she's cute." The protagonist kept wrestling with that question, taking it seriously like it mattered. Then Fio blurted out that she might not be able to keep going, her face burning red with embarrassment. Vaken stared at her without even turning his head. At first she sat there in silence, then she buried her face in her hands, and he finally shifted his eyes to the road ahead. And it hit him right in front of Fio, that he just spilled everything out with no filter, and Zosimo's instantly shot him a thank you for the full explanation. The guy went bright red and started scrambling to justify himself to her. The girl stared at him, eyes stinging, and demanded to know if he'd really lied. Then he froze, stunned. Then Bacon spun away from her and flat out said no, because it was way too honest, so he demanded she forget half of it, but she shot back, "I'm not doing that." She clasped her hands up in front of her face, cheeks burning, and blurted out that she was just so relieved he finally opened up and let her into his feelings. Confusion kept chewing at the protagonist's mind, then a whole week slid by. Zosimo's finally told him they'd be hitting the capital soon, so it was time to gear up and get ready. They finally rolled into Juri's royal capital, and Fio's eyes lit up. This place was glowing from top to bottom. She practically dragged everyone into the idea of enjoying the city and hitting the shops, right as her parents shot back. "So where's the king in all this?" Then Vaken snatched her hand, grinned, and told her everything was fine. He had zero plans to dive into politics, and the king barely even had a moment to squeeze in a meeting with some alchemist. Fio tried to argue, insisting this was an audience with the king. Then the guy shut her down cold and didn't care, and right then the guards snapped, called him by name and demanded, "What's your name?" The ma'am greeted him, promised they'd escort him because his majesty was already waiting, and that snapped Vaken into fury, while Fio told him, "Good luck." After a while they finally hit the castle gates, and the main character was marched straight into the Great Hall, where King Janus III of Juri Kingdom and his whole crew were already waiting. Vaken greeted him and burst in, saying he'd come the moment his work was done. Then Vaken revealed he was an alchemist. His name was Vaken Ord. One guy with glasses snapped that it was disrespectful to open your mouth without permission, and that empty-brain nobody thought proper introductions were good manners once. Then he blurted a loud apology and begged to start over. Then the king kept staring him down and demanded, straight-faced, "Tell me, did you really wipe out that legendary monster with ease?" Vaken shot back, "No way, that's not it." He figured the monster wasn't legendary at all, just a totally normal one that shows up whenever that specific pattern hits. Then the king leaned in and demanded, "Is this just a rumor?" And the main character admitted, "Yeah, I'm stuck in a remote village, so I've got no clue what you're talking about in the city." Right now, one of the king's men blurted out, "What kind of disrespect is this?" Because in front of the king, he won't even kneel, and he dares to reply with this arrogant little smile. Vaken couldn't shake the feeling that etiquette had changed again, so he admitted it. He came straight from the village and had no clue what the proper rules were, and if anyone had warned him ahead of time, he would have shown up ready instead of scrambling. Seconds later, the main character crumpled to the floor on his knees, demanding, "Are we good now?" And every subordinate stared at him in stunned silence like, "So what do you want from us?" Vaken told him that if anything was needed, he should hit up the Adventurers Guild, and they'd set the price for his work too. The king said he'd heard the protagonist brewed and sold magic potions, then leaned in and asked what he could make, so the protagonist grinned and said he could whip up tons, asking what exactly the king wanted him to craft. Then Vantant stared up at the king, right as the king stared back, and the guy blurted out, "Do you think I need a potion for hair loss?" The king erupted with rage at those words, and just like that, the main character was thrown into prison, locked up behind cold, unforgiving bars. Zosimo snapped that everything was a total failure, and he even prayed his master would get executed fast, until Vaken shot back, "I'm not in a rush to die, I'm just Kreen-oriented." And somehow, Zosimo's instantly understood exactly why people were freaking out. The protagonist asked the assistant if he'd come back to get him out so he could order the potion, and the assistant promised it'd be in about 3 days, but wouldn't say for sure that he'd actually be released. Vaken snapped that he wasn't staying put and urged them to get out, so Zosimo's demanded to know how he'd pull off an escape. Then Vaken asked whether a quick transfer would do the trick, and he got shut down immediately. The assistant warned he could kick up a scene to help with the escape, but Bacon snapped that it wouldn't do much good, then urged them to hit the problem the right way, and a glowing object burst into existence in his hands. The main character swore he'd whip up a hair loss potion for the king, and then the king would finally forgive him for sure. Zosimo's shot back that it was a pretty grown-up answer, while Zosimo's also feared he was about to wipe everyone out and bolt. The moment those words hit, the guy exploded in outrage. Vaken admitted it wasn't just his hair that was wrecking him. he was drained. Zosimo's fired back that in this primitive age, there weren't any artificial fairies, so of course he felt so exhausted. The main character claimed that back then everyone had their own artificial fairy, and the assistant jumped in, saying those fairies made everyone's life way better. Then Vacant offered to make the king an artificial fairy, and Zosimo snapped back, "Isn't that a bit much?" He insisted the potion alone should be enough, and the guy nodded, then jumped right into the creation process. First, the main character snapped his eyes shut and clasped his hands in front of his face. Then boom, he shot his eyes open and declared that it was time for everything to be cooked. After what felt like forever, the potion finally came out perfect. Zosimo's lit up and called it excellent, just like any true master would do. Then he teased back, asking if this was praise or if it was about to turn into criticism. Zosimo smiled and said, "Good, now we just have to forge a couple of artifacts." Right then, a soldier strode past, and when he spotted the main character casting magic, he jerked to a stop and demanded, "What are you doing?" The man demanded what the device was and where the boy got it, and the kid grinned and said he wanted to gift the king an apology. Then he begged the man to help him deliver it, because next he had to ask, "How do you open the door?" Vacant sneered that the lock was so primitive, even a monkey could crack it. Then he poured liquid metal into it, and it shattered instantly, before turning to the soldier and demanding he take him straight to the king. Then the man yanked up his weapon and snapped that stopping him was his job, and the protagonist just nodded like, "Yeah, that's exactly what I figured." At that exact moment, Bacon hurled one of his artifacts straight onto the soldier's body, then slammed the trigger to activate it. At first, he had no idea what was happening. Some hazy substance spilled onto his gear, and then his armor started to corrode right before his eyes. Seconds later, the man's body suddenly looked bare, so bare he froze in shock, staring at it and demanding, "What is this?" The protagonist didn't even blink. He spun toward Zosimo's and said they'd reach the king in no time, while the assistant immediately pushed back, asking if that was the real reason he was handed this artifact. This was dubbed mucus preparation number 18, and 5 centuries ago, it was all the rage. The second you toss it, the slime erupts and multiplies on the spot, melting the outer clothes clean off, leaving the target exposed, while it also zeroes in and triggers specific pressure points. People started pulling pranks with it, so fast that we had to figure out how to control its use before it went out of hand. Right then, the soldier ripped into the attacker again, "What is this?" and demanded, "Now take it off me." He whipped around and snapped, "I'm not dying to this, so don't freak out. You'll just be stuck with me, naked, with no armor." At this point, Zosimo said, "If we had artificial fairies, we'd snap them loose in seconds, but we don't," and Vacant shot back, then stopped staring and just move on. As the main character strode down the castle corridors, he suddenly ran into a group of soldiers, who grabbed his attention and shouted that they'd finally found him and desperately needed him to call for help. Soon enough, Vacant found himself boxed in by soldiers, a tight ring forming around him as weapons leveled toward his chest, and he couldn't help but stare in shock. Zosimo's demanded what they'd do, fight, and he smirked, saying there was no need, because he'd already cooked up a whole pile of slime with extra on standby, convinced he wouldn't slip by unnoticed. The main character stood there, stone calm. Then the soldiers lunged at him, and he snapped open a pack of mucus drug vials labeled number 18 and hurled them straight at their faces. At first, the soldiers brushed it off. Then Vacant activated the potions, and a warm surge wrapped the men's armor like a living cloak, and the soldiers' faces snapped with surprise. Bit by bit, the armor and every other piece of clothing started to melt away, and they demanded, "What is this?" The men kept moaning and spitting out weird, half-words. Then they finally noticed the slime chewing through their clothes, and one of them blurted, "What's happening to us?" Weird sounds kept blasting through the castle corridor, and still not a single person even flinched. After what felt like forever, every single man crumpled to the ground at the protagonist's feet, prostrate as stone. He barely even looked at them, just a quick glance. Suddenly, Bacon scratched his cheek, his nerves spiked, and he admitted it all looked kind of bad. Then the assistant nodded along, agreeing with him. Then the main character spun away and snapped that he didn't want to see any more wet men, and Zosimo swore he was convinced, once again, that the guy had no heart at all, so the guy laughed and said those were the best illegal artifacts. The assistant told him that if so, he could just grab an artifact that lets him change his appearance, and Viking admitted he never thought of that. Then, right on cue, a girl lunged at him, and he barely escaped with his life. The stranger swung at him again and again, but UI dodged every hit. Then he struck back and slammed him down onto the floor. She told herself she was lightning fast, nothing like the other guards. She could feel this meant someone strong, and then the girl finally found her, calling out her name like she'd been searching all along. The stranger gripped a sword in both hands, then snapped that she'd been handed an official order to execute him. so he better get ready right now. He shot his hands up in front of him, froze for a second, and blurted, "I swear, I haven't hurt a single person yet." She didn't react at all, just shifted a tiny bit, and told him to get ready to die. Turns out she's Princess Guardian Maya Fonte. Vaken scrambled to explain himself, begged her to hear him out, and told her he only wanted a chance to speak to the king. But she snapped before he could finish a single word. Then she flew at him with ruthless fury, and he barely dodged at the very last second. The girl flat out swore she'd stop him from getting anywhere near the king, and Bacon scrambled to explain that he'd brought medicine, until Maya snapped, "So you're really trying to poison him," and labeled him a villain. The protagonist snapped out of the next strike, dropped onto bent legs, then shot her a cold, decisive warning. She was one of those people who never listened. Bacon tried to argue back and insist he only wanted the king to live freely, but she snapped that he was clearly handing out illegal substances. Then Bacon stared at her in shock and demanded answers again. Maya Fonte yelled that he was slipping away from her attacks, proving he wasn't some ordinary nobody. Then he shrugged and shot back that he was just a normal alchemist. Zosimos asked if he should use the artifacts, and he said he could hold off for now. The assistant pressed him on why, because the girl was fighting for real, and Vaken nodded along, but his reply came out with a flicker of hesitation. He started telling her, "If I'm going to go all out in a real fight, you'll be offended, and after you lose, there's no way you bounce back that fast." He also said he didn't want to start swinging, because what kind of impression would that make on the king? Maya didn't like it one bit. She kept insisting, "I'm a girl," like it was non-negotiable, and the words just fueled the outrage. She gritted her teeth, seething. Her rage hit a boiling point. She screamed that he was a terrible person, then demanded to know if he'd underestimated her. Maya couldn't believe her ears. She'd actually heard him, and then she snapped into full rage, yelling that she'd execute him, slice his head off, and make him regret ever speaking. Right then the girl came charging and slammed him with a brutal hit. He might have been worn out, but he was still standing, and Maya stared at him like, "I hit you with everything, so how are you still alive?" Zosimos demanded he use a weapon, and he shot back that everything was fine. He was defending himself, not attacking, so the assistant just stared, calling it a weird rule. Zosimos barked that he had no choice but to defend himself, like maybe it was time to crack open the rest of the artifacts. But the other guy shot back that he wanted to dodge more fighting, and Zosimos thought, "Yeah, I could use that." In his mind, he was already picturing exactly how that potion would hit Maya, and his cheeks started to heat up red. Right then, his assistant broke in, saying he looked like he was cooking up something nasty. He snapped, told him to shut up, and insisted there was nothing wrong with his thoughts. While he was still locked in a conversation with Zosmos, the girl lunged at him again, because she warned him that during the fight, you can't afford to get distracted. He barely dodged her strike at the very last second. She finally knocked him off balance, and he crashed down. Right as he fell, he swung the vial of potion at her. She sliced it midair, but the blast still found its mark. After a few heartbeats, her armor crumbled and melted right off her, along with her clothes, and she gasped, frozen, demanding to know what was happening. The protagonist let out a sharp curse the moment the picture popped up in front of him. Zosimos even mocked him with a sarcastic, "Of course," like that wasn't exactly what he'd been begging for. Maya Fonte kept fighting through it all, down to almost nothing left, and then she smirked, calling it downright tempting, before daring him to say if he honestly thought he could beat her like that. The main character swore he wouldn't beat her. Then she snapped the test tube herself, barked at him to shut up, lunged straight at him, and right then she suddenly felt something. Vaken warned her not to twitch too much, and when she pressed him again to shut up, she snapped back that it wouldn't stop her. With every step, discomfort clawed harder at her. The guy swore it was just because she kept moving so much, so if she finally calmed down, she'd feel better, and the other guards would too. Maya Fonte just laid it out. She finally knows where every guard vanished to, and she warned everyone not to play down her power, because she's a princess guardian, and she means it. The girl tried every trick in the book, and she swore that no matter what chaos hit, she'd still stand between it and the king's life. Even her strength finally ran dry. Zosima admitted it still amazed her how few people can resist the slime, and the main character nodded right away. She'd always known she was a tough girl. Right then, Bacon snapped that even someone like her had a breaking point. Then he closed in on her. Then he tapped her forehead with a light poke. Boom. Her eyes flew wide open. And it was all because the mucus had cranked up her sensitivity. She swore that even with all the restraint she tried to force on herself, her entire body had somehow become wide open to whatever was out there. Zosimos leaned in and called him a real devil, and the guy smirked back, saying he could stare at her a little longer. Then the assistant went quiet for a beat, asking if he should really spill this to Fio, before the main character snapped to attention, remembered her, and froze on the spot. Right after that, Bacon snapped at him that he had to get out of there. Zosimo's bragged that his dictionary holds over 60 words to describe exactly what he looked like now, and the guy begged him to shut it and not say a thing. After a while, they tore themselves out of the castle, and the main character blurted, shocked, that they'd gotten out way too easily. So the assistant warned that if the place had been built to handle an attack from a truly bad person, it would have held them off. Zosimo swore the royal guard's captain, and even the prime minister, were still squirming with pure pleasure. At this moment, the protagonist said, "I at least got the potion to the king, and I already killed the activation code for that slime drug," and you could practically feel that everything was finally under control. After that, Bacon snapped that it was time to head back to Fio, because they were already late, while the assistant shot back that he'd never failed to dodge responsibility. After a while, they finally reached the hotel on Tuesday, and Fio lit up with a smile, greeting them like she'd been waiting. Then she asked, "So, how'd everything go?" He flashed her a sweet smile and told her like it was nothing, that everything had gone perfectly, no snags, no trouble. Then the girl asked how he'd been doing in the castle, and his gaze drifted as memories hit him, replaying every single event that had happened. Then he snapped back to reality, rubbing his face like the nerves were clawing him, admitting he was so rattled he couldn't remember everything clearly. The main character clocked that the king looked way too much like a king, burst into a laugh and shot back, "So what's so strange about that?" Bacon cut the conversation short and told her to go shopping instead, then rushed out an apology for keeping her waiting, and when he looked worn out, she urged him to take a breather. He flashed her a warm smile and told her everything was okay, like, as long as he was by her side, the exhaustion would just vanish. And once again, the girl blushed, flustered. Her face flushed red, and her whole body started to tremble, empty, confused. She couldn't figure out what was happening, until Zosimo's finally said, "Good." After that, they finally burst outside, and Theo asked, "Should we hit a restaurant?" And he shot back that it was his personal idea for them to go. A grin blossomed across her face, and the girl suggested they hit Bistro Aikshai, the seafood and vegetable spot. Bacon lit up and agreed, and just like that, they held hands. The main character blushed hard at her move, and right then Theo burst into giggles. He shot her a question, what on earth was she doing? And she smirked back, saying it was wild that she'd yelled at him the first time they ever met. Bacon nodded along, and she fired back that she'd even struck him too. Then bam, memories of their very first meeting crashed back into his head. The main character laughed, saying it hadn't been that long, but somehow it felt like they'd known each other forever. Then he giggled again. The girl shut her eyes, smiled along, and said she felt the exact same way. After a while, they finally slipped back to the hotel, and when evening hit, the protagonist dropped into the room and stared hard at the diagram. Zosimo scoffed that paper writing was ancient, then grilled Vakin, had he really forgotten his artificial fairy? Vakin smirked back that designing it was way easier when he sketched everything on paper. The main character told Fio he was crafting an artificial fairy, Alina, and as he said it, a bright, happy smile lit up his face. The support artifact is a fake fairy, an engineered little miracle that supercharges people's lives and makes everyday life way better. But Zosima, built by Vakin, was made for a totally different reason. She comes with her own AI, and if things get tricky, other artificial fairies can step in to feel, think, and talk too. Zosimo's listened to his speech, nodded like he'd caught every word, and said he understood everything. Then the main character turned to him and asked if it actually made him happy. His assistant admitted the question was brutal, then he pushed him. "So what do you even call that mix of nerves and joy?" The protagonist stared at his question for a bit, then finally tossed out, "Maybe this is what people call arousal." Then Zosimo snapped that he understood everything, like he wasn't just guessing, he was smiling on purpose. But he still needed high-level alchemical gear, and Vakin shot back that as long as the towers of the sages stood, the equipment was there. Feel strode up to him, slid her hands onto his shoulders, and demanded to know what he was doing. Then the guy calmly caught her wrists, pulled her in close, and pinned her against himself. He leaned in and told her it was a secret. He didn't want to ruin the surprise, and the girl shot back that it wasn't a surprise anymore. Vakin grinned and swore it would stay a surprise, because she'd be waiting with bated breath. A fresh day slammed into place, sunlight blazing against the window, and in the hotel, bright, upbeat sounds drifted from one room. He snapped awake, rubbed his head, and demanded who was pounding on the door, only to find out it was the hotel owner, Chu S1. Vakin swung the door open, told the man that someone wanted to see him, then lined in and asked, "You got a minute?" And the man shot back, "Who's it?" The man blurted that the visitor was a girl from the Imperial Guard, Maya Fanti, and that news instantly sent Vakin into a furious rage. After a while, the main character, awkward smile blazing, closed the distance to her, said her name straight to her face, and asked if she truly needed something. When he said that, the girl twisted her face in pure disgust and clearly showed she wanted nothing to do with him. Then she called him by name. He flashed a wide smile at her and said, "Alchemists live by one motto: let's make the world a better place." Then he leaned in and admitted he was one of them, his name, Vacant Ordi. Maya stared at him, stunned and wiped out by everything that just happened. Then he burst into laughter, and Zosimo said he looked like some fake religious guru. The girl just caved in, let out a heavy sigh, and blurted that the king was summoning him again. Then he froze, completely stunned. The main character admitted he'd have to turn it down since he's leaving tomorrow morning, and Maya snapped back, calling it a direct challenge from the king himself. Then the Vacant said it was time for him to leave. He had nothing else to do here, until the girl cut in again and said it was the king's challenge. He could already tell she wasn't gonna listen to him, so in his head he sighed, and then louder, he snapped, "I'm careless, that's just how I am. One slip and I'll say the wrong thing again, and boom, they'll toss me back in prison." And it hit her instantly how he'd treated her. Heat flooded her face as she blurted, "I don't want to come here either, but I have to bring him to the castle." Then Maiafanti told everyone that the potion the hero made for the king worked like magic, so the king swallowed his pride and shut up about what he'd done inside the castle. Vacant said you didn't need any fancy formalities for the potion, just say, "Thank you," if you truly felt like it. The girl shook her head and told him to come to the castle tomorrow morning. The main character clutched the truth like a curse, calling it pure tyranny. Then he openly snapped at the crowd with power, swearing he'd show up. Maiafanti spun to leave, and Arna blurted, "We're expecting him tomorrow, tell him to come." The main character believed he'd brought nothing but trouble. Then, bam, someone summoned him again, and his assistant leaned in and said she finally understood how he felt. Then Vacanha pulled a ridiculously funny face and swore that the next time he busted out of prison, he'd go all in, no holding back. Right here, the main character suddenly hit on a wild thought. Then he questioned why everyone seemed so off, and he got completely hooked by the way he treated them. Then Bacon flashed a sneaky grin and blurted, "This is huge news," because this round, he was already going to set up 3,000 in advance. Then his face flushed crimson. He stuck his tongue out like he couldn't wait, and declared that Maiafanti was about to get the worst of it. Zosimo snapped that drool was pouring out of his mouth, and the dude gasped, shocked, asking if that was really true. Right then, the protagonist watched Maiafanti drop to her knees out of nowhere, her whole body trembling. She snapped her gaze to him through tears and swore she'd kill him, and he muttered a curse under his breath. A fresh day dawned, and just like he promised, the main character stormed up to the king's castle, only to find the place packed with people again. Vacant and the king stared each other down, neither of them daring to speak, while everyone else held their breath in stunned silence. Then the king snapped, first telling him he wouldn't get grilled about what he did yesterday, and the guy just stared in stunned shock. Then the protagonist fired off a heartfelt thanks, and the man with glasses leaned in and said, "We need to talk about the potion, your gratitude, and what reward you'll get," before slipping it all into an envelope. The king jumped into the conversation, saying they were ready to talk about what comes next, and the protagonist's jaw dropped at his words. He told them that after that first incident, they already knew he was a real alchemist, because if he'd been working for another country, their nation would have been wiped out that very day. The main character stared at the thought and realized it had never even crossed his mind. Then, out loud, he admitted that this kind of option was totally possible. The man with glasses clocked it instantly, slammed the words home, and said they'd factor it in. Then he jutted his fingers at Vakin and declared they'd decided to invite him to work inside the castle, so the protagonist blurted, right away. The bespectacled man declared that from this day on, he'd oversee the country's alchemy in the king's name, and the moment he finished, everyone lit up and started clapping like crazy. He snapped, asking, "What do I do if I don't want to?" And everyone around him just froze, mouths hanging wide in shock. Right then, the guards closed in on him again, spears leveled in front of their faces as they hunted for the perfect opening to strike, and they shouted his name all over again. The man with the glasses leaned in and warned that the main character is insanely strong and downright dangerous, and they can't risk letting anyone else get their hands on him. The man insisted they had to get everything exactly right, so Bacon leaned in and asked if they honestly thought he could be controlled, and he was genuinely shocked by the question. The main character snapped that they'd better need his alchemy, because if he hadn't busted out of prison, nobody would have ever even noticed him. Manning's glasses snapped back that this was exactly why they wanted to dive into alchemy, so they could forge a government run by law, not chaos. The protagonist snapped, "Don't lie. This country has zero laws about alchemy or alchemists, and it doesn't even regulate selling or distributing potions you make with your own hands. The visibly nervous man stammered that they didn't have an expert, and Bacon shot back that they really wanted him to forge the law he deemed necessary. After that, the main character flat out said he can't even hold a conversation. Sure, he's respectful, but he refuses to get involved at all. Right then, one of the king's trusted men burst up from the side, shoved his spear toward him, and demanded to know if he truly understood nothing at all. The soldier kept insisting he couldn't turn his back on His Majesty the King. Then he leaned in and dared Vakin to just cut off his head right here and right now, because even if his artifacts were terrifying, with so many of them, they'd get the job done. The main character shot back with steel in his voice. Too many people here, and none of them could stop him, while the soldier beside him stared, completely stunned. Then Vakin stepped right up to the king and demanded to know, was that soldier really moving on the king's orders? The king blinked, honestly thrown by the question. Then the king's nerves started to scream. He snapped his gaze to the main character and ordered him to wait, because even his own soldiers got a temper that runs hot. But the soldier brushed those words aside and snapped, "I'm done suffering." He was sure this man was a threat to the kingdom, so whatever evil was driving him, it needed to be hunted down and wiped out. The main character warned him, "If you don't listen and you're still trying to kill me, then I'll have no choice. I'll have to treat you as the villain." Vakin fired back and said the soldier was way more furious than he was, and the moment those words landed, the soldier's rage exploded. The man snapped at the protagonist that he was a bad person, then slammed his weapon at him. Right then, the guy hit the activation again. Then a slime erupted on this soldier's body, melting through his clothes and armor like they were butter. Yet the poor guy had zero clue what it was or why it was happening. The protagonist flat out said it was a mucus number 18 drug, nothing to panic about, because the soldier wouldn't be able to move for a while, and honestly, he probably already knew that. The soldiers watching all froze in disbelief. Then one of them snapped in fury, yelling that he'd started doing it all over again. Meanwhile, the first soldier's clothes started fading until they were nearly gone, and all he could do was blurt out weird noises, leaving the other guards utterly baffled. The protagonist shoved himself up from his knees, shut his eyes, and spoke in a steady voice. They weren't better than bandits. They settled everything with nothing but bad actions. Vakin spun on his heel, declared that their talk was done, and started walking away, only for the king to scramble after him, yelling his name. The protagonist didn't even glance back. He just snapped at the man to rein in everyone under his control. He also said alchemy can pull people toward a brighter, happier future, and it's not meant to be used for selfish gain. The king's words set his nerves on fire, yet you could tell he'd finally clocked something. Then Zosimo's demanded whether he could pull the drug from Gertie, the guard commander, and Vakin just waved it off. Let him rest a bit longer, he won't die. A week later, they barreled back home and sprinted straight to the Dancing Duck Inn. Fio grinned and practically told her father, "We're home." The man shot right up to them, flashed a warm smile, and then leaned in to ask how their trip went. Fio laughed and said it was a blast as they grabbed a mountain of souvenirs. Then the man demanded he show them. Vakin cut in, asking how he got here without his daughter, and he answered that China helped him. The final one greeted him, and it was the exact same girl who had been trapped in the mirror dimension. The moment it happened, he flashed back to all those past scenes where he'd saved her, and he blurted out, relieved to the core, that she was finally okay and her health was fine. She grinned, thanked him, and then laughed that she was already as fit as a fiddle, so Bacon just smiled back, glad she was doing so well. Phil also thanked the girl for helping her dad, but China waved it off and said they didn't need gratitude, because they'd just arrived and they were way too beat to do anything else right now. Fio said there was no way she'd turn down that offer. Then she grabbed the protagonist's hand and declared they were heading upstairs to drink tea. Right here, Bacon and the girl finally clock it. Dad's been watching them the whole time and his stare screams, "What's going on?" He fires off questions. What happened, how they got so close, and when the heck they managed it. Fio slowly spun around and said, "Nope, I definitely imagined it." China jumped in, saying it made perfect sense since they'd just come back from a trip. The man nodded along, eyes blank, and let out a quiet breath. He shot up right away, shoved himself into the main character's space, and promised that if they drank together, he'd spill everything for sure, leaving the guy totally stunned. The protagonist's face flared red with panic, every nerve screaming as the pressure crushed him, because the only escape was to give in and agree. After a while, Bacon and the man ended up in a bar, staring at glasses piled with drinks in front of them. While his dad talked, the guy couldn't stop thinking, tomorrow morning, I'm going to feel sick all over again. The very next morning, the hero felt wrecked and hungover. He slumped down with his hands clamped to his head, face drained pale. The fake village hit him with the reminder that the owner drank 3 times what he was allowed, and the young man just said he remembered it. He didn't regret a single second, because that night of drinking with Edgar was totally worth it, and he finally got to have a real good time together. The system even snapped back like it still can't wrap its head around why anyone would trade short-lived pleasure for their health. Ken jabbed at the bottle crates and grinned. He'd earned his fun the hard way, carving out time to work and churning out several crates of the potion. The fairy shot him a reproachful look, and even drunk, the alchemist was still whipping up magical drinks, and the hero chimed in that he'd been tinkering in the workshop too, because soon he'd be able to brew even more. Suddenly, Maya burst into view right in front of him, coming straight to the guy with a request. The young man instantly got what the princess kneeling before him on one knee was asking for. Then he snapped, "What are you doing all the way out here in the middle of nowhere?" Ken spotted the royal figure kneeling, and it hit him. This is how you bow, and everything he'd done before was flat out wrong. Then the girl spoke to Ord in proper form. Maya declared she'd serve the hero, right on the king's orders. Then the young man blinked, clueless, and shot back that he'd never been told a thing. She yanked out the letter, and he tore it open on the spot. He heard the king finally wanted to apologize for his own arrogant ignorance, and to prove he meant it, he sent his daughter to Ken. His Majesty penned this. Maya is a top-tier knight. She's also properly trained, so she'll be useful to me. Then the letter closed with Jean's wish that Ken would someday learn to love Jury. After reading, the young man had to shove his pride aside and beg the princess to go back home, but Maya exploded in fury. Then the boy shot back that he wanted nothing to do with the royal family, and Maya snapped that she couldn't return to the castle. She didn't even try to hide it. She'd been ordered to lure the hero in with seduction, plain and simple, and the moment the young man heard that, he snapped that she couldn't always wear her honesty like a weapon. Then he started to walk away, and the girl panicked and lunged to stop him. She snapped that Ken couldn't just abandon her. Then the princess shoved the truth in his face. The dirt he'd done to her now meant no one would ever want to marry her. The young man snapped back to the moment he sent slime at Maya, wrapping her up tight and stealing her movement, and he immediately apologized, then remembered the king had said the girl was his daughter. The guy leaned in and asked if Maya was royal, and she snapped back that she was born from a concubine, so the palace crowd looked at her like she didn't belong. She said that's exactly why they chose to send her in as the sacrifice. Then Ken snapped that she shouldn't even bring up the plan to seduce him, calling it out as a ritual murder. He told her he'd already made up his mind. The young guy had swallowed the apology and even offered to step in if things went south, but he didn't want help, so he told the girl to head home. Maya wasn't backing down for anything. Out of nowhere, she lunged up to the hero and demanded to know how many times she had to say she wasn't going back. Ken froze, unable to even answer, while the girl's voice shook and her words tumbled out in shaky, unsure mumbles. She slid her hands over her body and told the boy he could punish her if she ever acted naughty, and the moment the young man clocked what she was into, horror hit him like a punch. Maya told him, "Don't talk about me like that, don't call me names," then flipped the script and begged him to scold her harder, and Ken snapped, screaming that he wanted absolutely none of it. He couldn't wrap his head around how it all spiraled like this, until the artificial fairy snapped. A single choice did it. That gentleman used drug number 8, and somehow it unlocked a brand new fetish for Maya. Ken whipped around to face the princess, told her to cool off right now and reminded her, this is the royal family, and if she keeps acting like this, they'll have to censure her. The girl refused to hear him and snapped that social rules were already dead to her. Nothing could hold her back now, while the young man just stood there, stunned, completely clueless about what to do with the princess. Theo heard the racket and rushed out to the guys, asking Ken straight up if they had a client. Ken just smirked and said they had a regular weirdo, and Theo couldn't wrap her head around why he'd call it that. The princess flashed a grin at the tavern owner's daughter, then introduced herself, Maya von Jury, the latest pleasure assistant hired by Vacant. Theo was completely thrown off, because the hero warned her not to take that girl seriously, saying she was basically creating misunderstandings just by showing up. Maya swept her gaze around and blurted, "Is this workshop yours? Any taverns around?" Theo nodded, and then the princess leaned in and demanded, "Can you make me a room to stay here?" The owner's daughter agreed with a bright grin, and Maya announced she'd be staying for the long haul before shoving over an entire bag of cash. Theo's eyes instantly exploded with dollar signs. The girl snatched the payment and bolted to get everything ready, while the princess smirked at Ken, delighted that she and the hero would finally share a home, only for Ord to brood on how he could get rid of her. 10 days rolled by since the princess moved into the dancing duck, and there in the garden, she and Ken were picking apples side by side, when Ken finally asked, "So when are you going home?" Maya just smiled and said, "I'm not going anywhere." She snapped back that she wasn't useless at all. She helped him gather alchemical materials. Then the guy let out a long, exhausted sigh, because he finally understood she was dead serious about being his bodyguard, and that realization made his nerves spike. Vaken spun toward the princess and warned her. He already had a lover, and that was Fio. The girl dropped to one knee and said she knew. Maya's eyes sparkled as she blurted, "I'm not going to be anyone's love, hell no." She declared she'd rather be his servant, his tool for pleasure. The boy shuddered again when that same look hit him, pure punishment waiting to explode, and he blurted out that he'd never, ever understand her. The girl kept staring at him like her heart couldn't let go, and the guy urged her to head back to the capital, until the princess exploded in a scream, swearing she'd never return and demanding the hero keep calling her those names. Ken, fed up already, let out a deep, exhausted sigh. Lately, Maya realized Mr. Vaken's world shrank to one thing. He hunted herbs day after day, and churned out healing potion orders nonstop. She challenged him, "So you're really not hunting monsters and conquering that labyrinth?" She insisted she'd be way more useful if he finally let her put her sword skills to work. The hero stared at the fruit in his grip like it held the answer, then snapped back that he couldn't do it, because of it. Ken leaned in and demanded to know what would happen if she, a princess, got hurt while she was standing near him. Those careful words hit Maya like a debt she couldn't dodge. Her face flared red, her mouth packed with fierce heat, and she muttered that the gentleman had turned unbelievably kind out of nowhere. The hero, though, that reaction lit a fuse of irritation in him. Ken was desperate to do something, so he thought about diving into the labyrinth, and the girl's face lit up instantly. She promised she'd go there with the hero, but he shut it down fast, flat out refused. The princess pressed him for answers, and the young man snapped back that he couldn't. He had to go on a guild mission he was officially registered for. Maya's bed wasn't coming with him. Ken couldn't drag her into the guild, so he demanded she listen, stay put, and wait at home. The artificial fairy lauded the gentleman, and Zosimo's snapped to attention. He was sure the princess would back off, so the guy could slip into the labyrinth calmly on his own, just like he planned. Out of nowhere, Maya shoved a folded note into his hands. He ripped it open, stared at what it said, and asked what the heck it was, and Maya just grinned. She was ready. The young man skimmed the page, and it hit him. She'd already been registered in the guild, and she was in the same group as Ken. His blood turned cold as a sweat broke out. With a grin, the girl announced their team was called the Slug Lovers Club, and the hero exploded, saying that name was way too weird, then demanding to know when you could start forcing people into a group without their consent. The princess snapped back that they were the royal family's ghosts. Then the young man mocked everything, saying the guild was run by monkeys, and the boy wasn't ready to swallow that at all. Watching the master's fury burn, Maya leaned in with hopeful eyes and asked if he'd finally punish her, while Ken trembled, powerless in front of the princess, and the fairy declared that this time, the young man had officially hit rock bottom. Suddenly, the system blared that a fight had erupted on the western path, so the hero snapped, ordering Zosimo's to scout it, and the fairy warned him there was just one man up against a monster that was brutally strong. That young guy couldn't wrap his head around how a creature like that was even showing up in a place that was usually calm, with barely any monsters, and the hero snapped his powers online, roaring, "It's coming for you." Ken shoved the bottle into Maya's hands and told her to drink it, right now. She blinked and asked what it was, and the alchemist said it was a speed potion that let her sprint about 10 meters in just 10 seconds. The young man handed the princess a bottle and kept one for himself. Then before they even drank, he declared that alchemy exists to help people, while Ken snapped, "Hurry." He ordered Zosimo's to drag them through the shortest way, and the artificial system carved a path and barked at the boys to march straight ahead. Soon, they stumbled on a towering monster crouched over the wounded boy, gripping his severed arm's elbow with a cruel, unshakable hold. The hero finally laid eyes on that monster for the first time, and his gut instantly told him whose new species it was. So he snapped an order to the fairy to dig up every detail on the enemy, while the princess shrieked at the boy to stay sharp and not miss a single thing. Ken snapped at the girl to protect the victim, and she bolted straight for the boy as he moved to handle the monster, drawing swirling circles around himself, and magical swords burst out from the rings. They blasted straight for the monster, but it didn't even flinch. Every sword strike detonated on its body, and still the thing kept breathing, and the young man couldn't wrap his head around how it was impossible to kill. The fairy admitted she was still digging through the archives for the truth, then she dropped the name. This monster is the beast of hatred. From records dated 500 years back, she pulled the proof, and the moment the hero struck, it didn't scare the thing at all. It only fueled its rage and goaded it higher. They tried to land a hit on the hero, but he juked out of the way. Bam, his strike crashed into the ground. Ken screamed, "That's impossible. I studied the whole archive, so I know this monster." The creature kept pummeling him from every direction, and he realized, if that speed potion hadn't hit his veins, he would have been dead already. Ken craved power that hit harder, so he surged into the attack, hunting for the enemy's true weakness, and the young man summoned elemental magical blades that whirled around him in midair like a storm. He hurled the discs at the monster, and it snarled back with furious defense. Then those long, powerful arms smashed the hero's blades to pieces, yet the young man didn't stop, throwing more again and again. That monster would not back down. While it got distracted, the boy yanked out the alchemist's staff and launched into the air, swinging with everything he had. One strike, no mercy. Ken slammed it into the beast and sliced it clean in half. Even though the boy had won, he knew he couldn't slack. He had to study this monster type. Then Maya's worried voice snapped his focus. The young man hurried over, and there she sat beside the boy's body. The princess blurted that they were late, but the boy didn't budge, just shut his eyes tight. Then Ken dropped into a seat beside the body and told the girl to keep staring without looking away. He promised he'd show her what real alchemy from the future can build, and right then, a glowing magic disc formed in the hero's hands. All at once, strange artifacts rained in around the alchemist, and with a snap of his power, a huge cup rose in front of him as he hurled every magical item straight inside. Then the artifacts vanished into the cup like smoke, and the hero yanked them back to safety, fast. He strapped the magical items onto the disc he had in hand, and with a sudden flash, a stone burst out as the young man tore it free. Ken shot his hands up, and his power fused with the artifacts. Then the hero sealed it all inside a tiny ball. Without ever grabbing it, the boy blasted the stone with magic and forced out a single drop. Then it plunked straight onto his head. A bright light erupted around him, and the boy suddenly jolted back to life. He snapped his eyes open and stared in shock, while Maya and Ken let out a wave of relief, grateful he was finally okay. After a while, the heroes galloped on horseback through the forest, while the princess stared in awe at Mr. Vacan's alchemy, so impressed she could barely breathe. The young man bowed, thanked her, and said she was finally free to go back home and tell the king what magic could truly do. Maya flashed a confident grin and swore she'd stay right beside him, because she wanted him to help people. The knight clearly wasn't thrilled, but he had a plan. The alchemist pushed for him to spill exactly what he'd just done, and Maya didn't even object. Then the hero kept talking. Bam, information poured onto Maya in a non-stop rush, telling her he'd used the La Messia potion, breaking down exactly what it was, how he mastered the skill, and even slipping in the whole idea behind the third-generation Nebral conceptual device. Maya's eyes bulged as the non-stop new info hit her all at once, and when the guy finally stopped and demanded, "Do you get it?" she couldn't even form a single word. She was wiped out. Zosimo's only shook his head and said that gentleman was pure evil. With a sly smirk, the young man thought, this isn't even close to the real level of a knight asterisk. But after spending time with Maya, he realized she wasn't just royalty. She worked for the people, and he genuinely saw her as a good soul. Ken knew the king had his own agenda and views, ones the hero might never get or accept. But thanks to Maya, Ken trusted that the king was finally ready to give this country a real shot, and the fairy even clocked that the gentleman had grown up in how he judged things. When the knight and the alchemist stumbled back to the tavern, the knight was already down, collapsed for good, while a defeated monster lay sprawled on the table right in front of Ken, and the hero couldn't even begin to name what it was. No organs anywhere, its metabolism didn't finish the job, and its epidermis looked like it was skinned from nettles. He leaned in, stared into the monster's mouth, and knew it was a predator. No tongue inside, just fangs built to rip. At first the skeleton looked human, but the tail and animal-like legs gave it away fast. Ken clocked it instantly. This wasn't a creature of nature at all. He demanded Zosimo's dig up real answers on the monster. The fairy went to work at once, and no matter how deep she searched, the truth never changed. As screens flashed a stack of documents and articles in front of him, Zosimo zeroed in on what the sage of the Modus dynasty said. Messy, vague, but dead on. And after the hero read it, he turned to the fairy and demanded what she really thought. Everything he saw and read felt unreal, like the world had gone off script, and Ken quickly realized something chilling. Since the monster first showed up, nobody ever learned a single new thing about it. He figured the monster might be the crack that toppled the Modus dynasty, but the fairy cut in fast. This was only a guess, and they had to dig into the monster's past, because right then, someone knocked on the door. The princess marched up to him, and the girl told him she'd already reported the monster to the palace, then learned they actually had files on him. So this is exactly what the hero needed. He asked if he could see them, and Maya shut it down fast, saying the records were a royal secret, and it would be hard to get a look. The young man snapped at Zosimo's to track down the royal archive and map a way inside, and the fairy promised she'd dig the castle's layout straight from the database. Maya stalled for a moment, then bit the bullet and went straight to the master for answers. She demanded to know who Bacon really was, and the guy froze. He hadn't seen that coming. then blurted out, trembling, that he was an alchemist. The girl figured the hero would blurt out something like that, then snapped back that she wasn't buying it. She wasn't satisfied at all. And when the young man caught Maya's stare, doubt and anxiety punched through her eyes. He had no idea if he could pull off the lie. The princess demanded he understand her, swore her loyalty to him would never bend, and Ken just casually tossed back. So you're not planning to reject the seduction, right? The hero swallowed his pride and apologized for prying, then demanded why she cared so much. Maya's face went hot with embarrassment, because she just wanted to know everything about the man she loved. And for her, that made perfect sense. The alchemist never saw that confession from the night coming, so he glanced at the fairy and murmured the next move, while Zosimo scoffed that the gentleman was acting pathetic. Then Maya spun around and faced the magical creature. The girl demanded, "Why do I look like this? And what do you mean by an artificial fairy?" Zosimo said she was a vacant's assistant, a kind of artifact, and the young man clocked how slick and smart that fairy had been. Maya swallowed her nerves and admitted she'd already guessed it. Then the hero blurted his confession was up next, but he snapped that he hadn't even really told his beloved the first thing about himself, and the girl brightened, thrilled, and intrigued. A knight suddenly lunged up to the young man, and now that she'd cracked his secrets, declared she'd stay one step ahead as his woman, but he snapped back instantly, totally clueless, demanding to know if Maya was trying to get him to punish her like this. The princess said that when her father mistreated her mother, she swore she'd never fall for a man. Then the moment she met the gentleman, love slammed into her like a thunderclap. Finally, the girl let out a long sigh, begged for forgiveness, and spilled every word she'd been holding back. Then she made up her mind to go. Right before she left, Maya told him to forget everything. She blurted out the truth. She just wanted to be real with the person she loved, nothing more. And that raw honesty hit him so hard the hero's mind completely flipped. He cut right through the moment and blocked the princess. Ken told her he couldn't spill the details, then admitted the truth. He really had been reborn. The princess stared at the young man, stunned. Ken's eyes sharpened with sorrow, like the weight of the world hit all at once. Then he said, "I'm from the modest dynasty, and I'm an alchemist who lived 500 years ago." While Tarask brooded atop the cold mountain, rage toward Ken burned in his chest. Yet deep down, he still couldn't deny the hero's truth. Tarask nodded, saying alchemists chase a brighter tomorrow. But then he leaned in and demanded the young man remember one crucial thing. The boy's face contorted with fury and bitterness, his eyes turning pitch black. He was about to burn into the emptiness with every sin. When Maya finally got the shocking truth that the gentleman had been reborn, she snapped in surprise, again, and the young man nodded, admitting that because of strange circumstances he'd been asleep for 500 years. And yeah, he still looked young, but he was really 40. The girl nodded, and she couldn't help noticing just how calm Ken was for someone his age. Then the princess knew the truth about who he really was, and he asked if she was feeling better. Right then, the fairy shot up to her master. She asked the gentleman if he truly knew what he was doing. Then he got totally lost, because she never let him get a word in while Zosmos talked his way through it. But Maya, finally clocking the whole situation, lit up with a smile, grateful that Ken had opened up to her, and she thanked him. The young man nodded, and suddenly he caught himself wishing someone would just hear him out. The alchemist confessed to the knight that the same thing happened to him, and he thanked it with real gratitude. Right then, Maya's real nature burst through the air, and she demanded to know if this secret was finally just theirs now. Ken swallowed hard and admitted she had to keep it, because it was her duty. Staring at the princess, the guy snapped, asking where that fierce attitude had vanished, only for her to fire back that he should stop clinging to appearances and tell her if he'd actually date someone, since his real age is 40. The young man leaned in and corrected her, saying that in his past life he'd never made it past 40, so now he'd fallen somewhere in his 30s. The headline hit Maya so hard her nose started bleeding, and when the guy saw her react, he couldn't even get it, so he snapped at her and called her behavior unacceptable. Then the knight told him to scold her even more. A few days later, when everyone finally lined up and got ready, Ken dropped a bombshell. He wanted to head back to his hometown, and even the others were stunned. He explained he wanted to work outside the village, so he figured he might as well swing by the city at the same time. Fio and Maya hurried up to the young man and promised they'd go with him, but the boy insisted the road was a long, deadly grind. Then the artificial fairy chimed in, backing him up and warning that monsters would be waiting for them along the way. Fio finally confessed she'd been dying to see where her beloved lived, and Ken got it. He could feel the pull in her words. Then he considered Maya's strength to hold her ground, but he couldn't quite trust how Fio would handle things. Right then, Zosimo surged past the master and swore he'd take the girl on a journey. Ken didn't see that coming. Fio lit up, hugging the fairy tight. Meanwhile, the hero fumed inside his head, yelling at Zosimos for stealing his chance to help, and for taking a step toward his girl's love. The boy had no choice. He had to plead with Edgar for help, and the man just chuckled, saying the kid was old enough to want to go home, then turning to Ken, "Take the girls with you." Edgar stepped up and asked to greet his parents for him, and the boy froze solid at those words, because the hero couldn't bring himself to tell them the truth. Theo had already lost his parents, but this was his golden opening to finally meet Midas, because he didn't just want to see her, he wanted her to truly know the real him. Watching the girl toy with the artificial fairy, Ken's stomach dropped with doubts, because once Theo heard the truth, Ken feared he'd be rejected, like the modern world only sees him as a walking dead. Maya told Via they'd hit the market first thing tomorrow and get ready for the trip, and Via's face lit up at the plan. Meanwhile, the hero stared into the night, thinking that with the princess by their side, they might actually end up having a great time. Maya caught the gentleman staring at her, and her cheeks flamed red. Then she bounced up and down in pure delight. Ken finally nodded and agreed to take the girls with him with a grin, while Theo confessed she was dying to see what her lover's hometown was really like. Their journey dragged on for 3 brutal days, and when the heroes finally made it, the artificial fairy blared, "You're here," but all they saw was a dead wasteland. The girls froze, baffled, and Maya turned to Zosimos, demanding, "Are we even in the right spot?" The fairy didn't blink. "The city is underground." Zosmos ignited, and the ground beneath the heroes shook like crazy. Then the fairy swung open the emergency exit, and when the extra stones and buildings crashed down, they stared at the only stone entrance right in front of them. Down below, a spiral staircase yawned open, ready to swallow them whole. First the young man charged down, then the girls followed. The fairy kept insisting they could build an elevator, but every idea crashed and burned. The hero just smirked and said it was still better than the wrecks. Zosimos nodded along with the owner and said that so far, the ventilation system and lights were running flawlessly. No issues, not a single hitch. Theo leaned in and demanded to know where they were going, and the hero answered, saying they were headed straight for the ruins of Modus. Then the girl shot back, "Wait, aren't we going to your hometown?" The young man snapped back that he'd have to talk for ages, and swore Modus was his hometown. Then candles flared down the corridor, and as the light swept the boys aside, the city's ruins laid bare before them. Ken met the girls in Modus, and when Maya stared up at the skyline, lit like gold and silver, she straight up lost her breath, but Ken couldn't ignore it. A lot of things had crumbled, so it didn't feel quite as grand as it looked. Theo grinned at Modus, and admitted the city felt unreal and absolutely fabulous. Then the young man caught every word. He slid up to her and pressed the question again, and this time she swore their people have a legend, the golden fairy tale town of Modus. Ken grilled the fairy about it, but she couldn't name a thing. Then Zosimos turned to Theo and demanded she spill the story. The artificial fairy was about to record the narrator's voice and stash it in an archive, and the girl blurted that she'd probably feel mortified. But Zosimos promised she'd replay the recording every night like a bedtime story, and Theo didn't mind one bit. She started spilling the story. A long time ago, Dill was just a young guy in a village, and his little sister was dying from sickness. He busted his tail every day to scrape together money for medicine, but she kept slipping farther and farther away. So the boy grabbed his chance and brought her straight to Modus, the Golden City, and to the wizards a traveler once bragged about, knowing full well that for help they'd demand treasures and total obedience. Still, not a single alchemist would lift a finger for the young man. He didn't show up with enough money and treasures, and they wouldn't budge for less. Meanwhile, the wizards lived in a fortress of untold riches, yet their greed never stopped. They still demanded more gold and silver. The boy was totally lost, frozen on what to do next. Meanwhile, the young man stumbled out into the street holding his sick sister, despair crashing down on him, until one person finally spotted him. When he heard the young man out, he just smirked, because his face was kinder than any wizard in the city. Then the man reached out, told the boy he'd been lucky to meet him. The moment the alchemist said that, he snapped his wand up and blasted a spell straight at the poor girl, and her body erupted into a terrifying glow. She felt a sudden rush of strength, like she'd been healed in an instant. She could jump, run, and move like nothing ever hurt her. Then the young man bowed and thanked the wizard, firing off the big question, why he'd been so kind to them, before he finally pulled the hood off his robe and answered. The alchemist grinned and told them it mattered most to stay kind to everyone. Then whoosh, he turned into the wind and vanished. The sister and brother were so grateful they swore to live by his rule forever. Once Phil wrapped up his tale, the fairy and the hero finally understood everything, click like a lock turning in place. The girl finished with, "It's a famous fairy tale everyone in jury knows," and her eyes widened at the fact Ken didn't know it. Ken hesitated, then nodded like he'd just been caught off guard. Zosimos blurted out that the wizard from the tale was the real master. Then Theo froze, totally lost, and demanded to know how on earth Kin fit into that story. The artificial fairy stripped the boy's secret. He wasn't a wizard at all, and warned him that in this twisted city of gold and silver, greed ruled nonstop while decent people were almost extinct. The young man rushed up to his beloved, threw out an apology for keeping her in the dark, and when he finished, Fio still didn't have a clue what he meant. He finally blurted out that he was a man who walked this world 500 years ago, and when he caught the girl staring in shock, Ken leaned in and told her, straight up, he'd been born ages and ages ago. Out of nowhere, Fio's face lit up, and the young man was stunned, because suddenly Maya understood why her beloved knew so much, and when she noticed Maya wasn't even shocked, the girl leaned in and asked if the princess had already cracked this secret. She bragged that she'd heard it faster than Fio. Then the girl puffed her cheeks and admitted she was jealous. She leaned in and asked if the princess and Ken had been getting really close lately, and the guy shot back that it sounded unbelievable, but he still stood with Fio. The hero leaned in and asked his beloved if the new rumors about him would ever scare her off, because he was 500 years older than her. Fio only smiled, soft and certain, saying she didn't mind at all, because her kind never truly changes. She stepped in close and pressed her forehead to the young man's, and when she admitted she was shocked to find out he was basically a wizard straight out of a fairy tale, she doubled down, because that twist made her love the story even more. Maya watched the couple with a warm grin, like she was bracing for something to happen next, and that's exactly when the artificial fairy grabbed the gentleman's attention, asking if he'd hug her too, but the young man shrugged it off and said there was no need. He broke down crystal clear what the girl was going through, being treated like a pitiful knight who gets ignored, and yeah, she actually loved that feeling. Then the guy told Zosimo's to watch the princess's face, because in front of Fio she was biting her tongue and holding back as hard as she could. The fairy let out a heavy sigh and nodded. Maya had already got her reward just like this. Then the trembling knight blurted that she was the master's servant, and said there'd be no trouble at all, because she was a warrior. Suddenly Ken called out for her to come to him, thrusting his hand forward and telling her that once she knew his secret, she was family now. Maya and Fio rushed up together, wrapped him in a hug, and beamed like everything was perfect. The heroes pushed deeper into the ruined city, and every step the princess took only revealed more gold-dusted streets, no end in sight, no matter how long they wandered. The young man finally spit it out. The alchemists back then had figured out how to move gold, and that was how they got rich. He said that this precious metal was so everywhere that people turned it into building material just to flaunt their power. And with Modus stacking his forces with plenty of combat alchemists, other countries didn't just notice him, they feared him. Even a city built to thrive for thousands of years vanished overnight, and the guy couldn't wrap his head around it, so he vowed to hunt down every single reason. With the era changing, even the top alchemists vanished without a trace, like the world was warning them. Ken knew that if the catastrophe struck again, it could spiral into something far darker, and he couldn't shake the fear that every single friend and loved one of his might be gone. Right when the hero was about to think things through, a fairy swooped in and cut him off. She'd already gathered everything she could from the 3 closest sage towers, and she asked Zosimo's if their master was finally ready to hear it. But when she spotted Ken's nerves, the girls stepped in and rallied around him. They beamed at him and nodded like everything was finally clicking. Then the young man leaned in and demanded the artificial fairy show him everything, so Zosimo's obeyed, and a screen burst into view in front of him. What he saw made his stomach drop, hideous footage of carnage. Monsters of hate had slammed into Modus and ripped through the citizens, slaughtering everyone in their path. The people fought back with everything they had, but nothing could stop them. The heroes never saw these monsters coming, and Zosimo's cut in, saying she had one more thing to show the master. Then she popped open a new screen, and what the guys saw instantly left them stunned. Zosimo's was tearing into humans, and Ken couldn't believe what those artificial fairies were pulling off. Then Zosimo's realized something was off in their heart, the fairies' central control, the mother core. Theo demanded to know if the system was okay. Then the fairy snapped back that it ran on its own, because the mother core never touched it, and only the master had built it that way. Ken told me Zosimo's wasn't just code, she had her own mind. He'd never, ever risk linking her to the general system, because her fairy was different from all the rest. That guy demanded to know why the breakdown happened, and Zosimo said the mother core is basically a flawless, centralized control system. The fairies mattered big time because they kept everything safe, so Zosimo snapped that the disaster Ken saw wasn't on them at all, it was humans to blame. She told that gentleman to look at the wounded, and the moment the young man tried to snap at Zosimo's for showing death to Fio, horror hit. The bodies started melting from the inside, and something crawled out. It was a beast of raw hatred. An assistant even spells it out. This is what these monsters really are. They crawl out of people's bodies after artificial fairies get their hooks into them. Right then, the young man snapped to the truth. The country had been shattered by the very system everyone trusted most, and someone had turned it loose to hurt innocent people. Zosimo's dropped the bombshell. 500 years back, a massacre erupted because people dared to cultivate artificial intelligence, and the potions influenced twisted bodies until monsters were born. That jaw-dropping truth hit Ken like a punch. He needed a moment to process it, because Zosimo stood right beside the master, just as stunned by the same bombshell, and Ken couldn't wrap his head around the cruel gap between those who lived and those who didn't. First, his fairy moved on its own, totally cut off from the mother core. Second, the cradle of rebirth stepped in and gave him the boost he needed. Third, he had trusted subordinates, people he could count on no matter what. He replayed the disaster day in his head, wondering what the lab had unleashed, and he realized he was lucky. His artifact was buried deep underground, so it let him make it to the future. The hero still swore he could have crushed the nightmare before it even began, if only he'd woken up. But he didn't have time. Ken had been reborn 500 years after those brutal events, and the young man shook with dread, furious that he still hadn't been able to stop the chain of horrors. Seeing the guy choke up with emotion, the girls panicked, so they slid beside their friend and begged him to believe he hadn't done anything wrong. Suddenly, a screen blasted open in front of the young man, and the artificial fairy chirped that she'd uncovered something else that could matter to his master. Right then, his whole team materialized before him and greeted their boss. Ken froze in shock. He never expected to run into his old friends again. They told him Modus was finally finished, so they were rushing to record a dying message for the boss. Then they grabbed their gear, stormed out of the lab, and swore they'd stop the disaster before it exploded. Right then, the monster of hatred crashed through the cracks and slammed into them. So the girl clenched her courage and declared that since it was their final day, she'd use this moment to confess her feelings to Ken, and the comrades were left reeling. He flashed a confident grin at the camera, thanked the hero for bringing him onto the team, and swore he'd make sure the monsters never tore everything apart. Another comrade stepped up, swallowed his pride, and apologized for messing with the rebirth cradle's settings, then swore the boss's illness would be wiped out for good, never coming back again. But he had no idea, centuries and centuries later, he'd finally wake up and still wish the chief a good rest, while his comrades swore they'd guard his body with their lives. The girl blurted again that she loved Ken, and when they finally pulled away, they just prayed Ken would stop living for everyone else and start living for himself. The recording cut out. Tears burned in Phil's eyes as she said her lover's friends were good people, and he nodded, because they were exactly the crew he'd been searching for. The master ordered Zosimos to sneak into the black boxes of every alchemy lab and rip out everything he could, especially clues about the mother core and the monsters, since he was dying to know how the monster of hatred showed up near Sullivan. The artificial fairy obeyed on command, and the hero dug in with total determination to crack the whole mystery, because in that ruined city, tons of sages and brilliant alchemists were living and breathing, yet not a single one could change a thing. Only Ken was left, and if anyone could stop this, it was him. He knew this was his one shot to reinvent his life, build a brighter future, and make sure the same disaster never hits again. A few days slid by since Modus' visit, and the moment the young man told the girls goodbye, the boys piled into the tavern, while Fio's nerves sparked and she demanded, "Can you really handle this alone?" Ken just grinned and promised it was only a bit of research. Maya refused to let that gentleman walk away by himself. He insisted he was the only one with the artifacts, power to match an entire army, and all Maya could do was stand there with nothing to say. She snapped back and promised to round up the knights and sweep the area herself. Then, with the intel Zosimos handed over, the young man pinpointed the most suspicious spot and locked it in as the only place that mattered. Burial Forest, buried deep in ruins, where deadly monsters stalked the shadows. So many wizards died there that the archive still screams it. Back then, people called them alchemists, rhinestones of time, so there was a solid chance they were all that was left behind, scraps from the remains, and Ken was convinced this had something to do with the beasts of hatred. So the hero headed there straight away to dig up the truth about these monsters, and when the young man feared they might strike again, he ordered Maya to rally the knights for a patrol. The princess and the alchemist scrambled up to the high ground and stared down at the mass of knights. Ken couldn't believe Maya was leading them herself. She shot back that if it was for the people, then it was for the country. She told him that if the gentleman knew that place was dangerous, he needed to turn back, and the guy waved it off, saying she shouldn't worry, because he could handle himself and protect against whatever came. The young man fretted that the city would stay silent, but the princess snapped back that she'd gladly throw her life away if it came to that. The hero whipped around and roared that she had to live, because she meant everything to him. The girl lit up at the scolding, because in the same breath she realized Ken actually cared about her. Then Ken doubled down, swearing he didn't want the princess hurt, and if trouble showed up, she'd grab Theo and bolt. He choked on the memory of the comrades who died for the boss's safety, then snapped at Maya to not overdo it, while she just couldn't figure out why those words hit so hard. The boy asked, "Can I complain?" And the princess just shrugged it off. Then he confessed he didn't want to be alone and he didn't want any of them getting hurt, while the girl nodded, saying she fully got him. The boy admitted he was terrified, and Ken snapped that this can't happen again. He'd already bled enough, and he wouldn't let them lose more. Then Maya said, "If that gentleman can live in peace and build a bright future, his comrades will finally be happy." Ken nearly choked on the thought, then muttered that she might be right. The princess slid closer, telling him he could do great things, until he forgot himself and she leaned in to kiss his forehead. The girl commanded the young man to come back, because even the princess herself had kissed him, and then she leaned in and begged him, "Don't tell Theo about this." Ken marched into the grave forest with the artificial fairy, begging her to check whether Zosimo's had spotted any life, only for her to come up empty. An hour had already slammed by since they crossed into the forest, and the air felt way heavier with every step. Zosimo's warned them they could run into broken artificial fairies, so they'd better stay sharp. Out of nowhere, the boy snapped to attention as a bell-like sound raced closer and closer, and the fairy leaned in to tell him it wasn't magic noise, it was motion itself. The spellwork in the air was trembling and singing out a sound just like a bell. The young man suddenly snapped to the horrifying possibility. Maybe something undead was standing right ahead, since Zosimo's hadn't picked up a single trace of life. The fairy even guessed it could be the ruin's guardian, and just then, a slash cut through the tree trunks in front of the hero. The magical blades started closing in on the hero, and he barely dodged each one in time, until the swarm overwhelmed him, so he hurled his explosives and detonated them. Right after the blast, a witch stepped into view, looming way bigger than the young man. She was the one making the bells ring, and Ken jumped in. "Can I talk to you?" She didn't answer at first. The guy only introduced himself as an adventurer and an alchemist, and then the witch started muttering about the master of death, destruction, and the very end. The monster vows it'll bring ruin and death to everything. Then she asks someone where they're headed. Ken hears it all but understands nothing. The artificial fairy jumps in, assuming Alchemist triggers an automatic response, and declares she's run a complete analysis. Zosimo swore that an artificial fairy stood right in front of them. Then the witch's body rotted in seconds, and out crawled a brutal monster like a giant insect. The monster erupted in a brutal squeal, demanding to know where the owner had been, and insisting a brand new era was already creeping in. Zosimo's pressed him, asking if he'd spotted an artificial fairy ahead too, trapped inside a shell filled with hatred, and the owner nodded, confirming it. But the guy lit up with confidence. He was certain he had the strength to crush the enemy, and he silently told his fallen comrades to look close, because he was about to unleash his real power.